As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
Economics is haunted by more fallacies than any other study known to man. This is no accident. The inherent difficulties of the subject would be great enough in any case, but they are multiplied 1,000-fold by a factor that is insignificant in, say, physics, mathematics, or medicine, the special pleading of selfish interests. While every group has certain economic interests, identical with those of all groups, every group has also, as we shall see, interests antagonistic to those of all other groups. While certain public policies would in the long run benefit everybody, other policies would benefit one group only at the expense of all other groups. The group that would benefit by such policies, having such a direct interest in them, will argue for them, plausibly and persistently. It will hire the best viable minds to devote their whole time to presenting its case, and it will finally either convince the general public that its case is sound, or so befuddle it that clear thinking on the subject becomes next to impossible. In addition to these endless pleadings of self-interest, there is a second main factor that spawns new economic fallacies every day. This is the persistent tendency of men to see only the immediate effects of a given policy, or its effects only on a special group, and to neglect to inquire what the long-run effects of that policy will be not only on that special group, but on all groups. It is the fallacy of overlooking secondary consequences. In this lies almost the whole difference between good economics and bad. The bad economist sees only what immediately strikes the eye. The good economist also looks beyond. The bad economist sees only the direct consequences of a proposed course. The good economist looks also at the longer and indirect consequences. The bad economist sees only what the effects of a given policy has been or will be on one particular group. The good economist inquires also what the effect of the policy will be on all groups. The distinction may seem obvious. The precaution of looking for all the consequences of a given policy to everyone may seem elementary. Doesn't everybody know in his personal life that there are all sorts of indulgences delightful at the moment, but disastrous in the end? Doesn't every little boy know that if he eats enough candy, he will get sick? Doesn't the fellow who gets drunk know that he will wake up next morning with a ghastly stomach and a horrible head? Doesn't the dipsomaniac know that he is ruining his liver and shortening his life? Doesn't the Don Juan know that he is letting himself in for every sort of risk, from blackmail to disease? Finally, to bring it to the economic, though still personal realm, do not the idler and the spendthrift know, even in the midst of their glorious fling, that they are heading for a future of debt and poverty? Yet when we enter the field of public economics, these elementary truths are ignored.
So this story says that Hamas says it wants to extend truce with Israel after the latest prisoner swap. So since Friday, since this ceasefire or pause, whatever you want to call it, came into effect, it has pretty much held. There's been Israeli fire on Palestinians who were trying to return to northern Gaza, displaced Palestinians who were trying to go back home. They were fired on, but besides that, I haven't seen any major violations of the ceasefire aspect of the deal, and they've been exchanging prisoners throughout the 3 days. So Hamas said on Sunday that it's ready to extend the 4-day truce with Israel after the two sides exchanged prisoners for the third straight day. Hamas said in a statement, quote, "The Islamic Resistance Movement Hamas seeks to extend the truce after the 4-day period ends through serious efforts to increase the number of those released from imprisonment as stipulated in the humanitarian ceasefire agreement," end quote. So the hostage deal allows an extension in the 4-day truce in exchange for Hamas releasing more hostages. Earlier in the day, a Hamas source told AFP that the group could potentially release 20 to 40 more Israelis. Qatar, which brokered the deal, said that Hamas does need to locate dozens of Israeli women and children who are being held in Gaza by other groups, not by Hamas. And Qatar is saying they need to do that in order to extend the pause in fighting. So the Israeli side has expressed interest in extending the 4-day truce if Hamas releases more prisoners, while making it clear that the war will continue once the pause is over. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spoke with President Biden on Sunday and said his government is willing to extend the ceasefire 1 day for every 10 hostages that Hamas releases. So Netanyahu said that he also told Biden that, quote, "At the end of the deal, we are returning to full power to carry out our aims, destroy Hamas, ensure that Gaza won't return to what it was, and of course, to free all of our hostages," end quote. This article is from Nick Turse at The Intercept, and it's really something. It says that U.S. military outposts in Iraq and Syria are plagued by thefts of weapons and equipment, according to exclusive documents obtained by The Intercept that show militias and criminal gangs are systematically targeting U.S. forces. Military investigations launched earlier this year found that multiple sensitive weapons and equipment, including guided missile launch systems as well as drones, have been stolen from Iraq, and this follows hundreds of thousands of dollars in military gear that were purloined from U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria between 2020 and 2022. So that is a lot of theft. Weapons are being stolen straight out of the bases. Missiles, I mean, it's unbelievable. And it goes to show, as Turse, the point he makes in this piece, as these bases are coming under attack and the U.S. is claiming that they're protecting the troops there, if they can't protect the bases from theft of this scale, there's no way that they can really say that they're protecting the U.S. troops who are at these bases in Iraq and Syria, who are just basically sitting ducks to pay for Biden's support for what Israel's doing in Gaza. This article is from Kyle Anzalone, and it says that David Arakamiya, who's a high-ranking member of Zelensky's Servant of the People Party, has confirmed that Kiev could have ended the war with Russia after a month if it agreed not to join NATO. So Arakamiya was leading the Ukrainian delegation in peace talks with Russia in March 2022 when they met in Istanbul, and negotiations continued into April virtually. And at the time, it was very clear that Russia's main demand was Ukrainian neutrality. Say you're not going to join NATO. There was also other things about denazification, demilitarization that was very vague. But he says in this interview with a Ukrainian TV channel, he says that other stuff wasn't really important. It was all about the neutrality. He said, quote, "They really hoped almost to the last moment that they would force us to sign such an agreement so that we would take neutrality. It was the most important thing for them. They were prepared for an end to the war if we agreed to neutrality and committed that we would not join NATO," end quote. He said everything else was simply rhetoric and political seasoning, talking about the denazification and that stuff. He also explained that Kiev was unlikely to accept Putin's offer during the talks in Istanbul because Ukrainian leadership did not believe Russia could be trusted. However, he went on to say that then UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson cemented Kiev on the path of fighting a long war with Russia. So essentially what he says is, we probably couldn't trust Russia, although there was supposed to be some sort of security guarantees. But the crux here is that he is confirming that Boris Johnson went over to Kiev in April 2022, which was reported by Ukrainian media, and said that they don't want to sign a deal. He said, quote, "Moreover, when we returned from Istanbul, Boris Johnson came to Kiev and said that we would not sign anything with them at all, and let's just fight," end quote. So China called the U.S. the biggest disruptor of peace in the South China Sea after a U.S. warship sailed near Chinese-controlled islands in the disputed waters. The U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet said Saturday that the guided missile destroyer USS Hopper sailed near the Paracel Islands known as the Shisha Islands in China in an operation known as the Freedom of Navigation Operations, what they call FONAPs. And the U.S. began regularly conducting FONAPs to challenge China's claims to the South China Sea in 2015. The area where the USS Hopper conducted the FONAP is also claimed by Taiwan and Vietnam. The Chinese military said that it warned off the U.S. warship after it entered the Paracel Islands territorial waters, which extend 12 nautical miles from the coastline. So that's pretty close. When they do these FONAPs, the U.S. Navy gets pretty close to these islands claimed by China that are controlled by China, that are much closer to China than the Chinese mainland and the United States.
Trump had little respect for the First Amendment, Democrats claimed. He attacked freedom of speech and of the press, striking at our fundamental rights. On top of this, liberal media outlets alleged Trump used his office for personal gain and weaponized the justice system for his own benefit. After January the 6th, 2021, the liberals who had been skeptical about anti-Trump hysteria became convinced that the hysterics had been right all along. But Friday's release of the first tranche of January 6th tapes confirmed that Trump's actions paled in comparison to the steps Democrats have taken to defeat him and his supporters. The tapes corroborate public's previous reporting and show that the Democrat-driven narrative of an insurrection was highly misleading. Democrats use this narrative to demonize tens of millions of voters, to justify their censorship efforts, and to weaponize the justice system against their political enemies. They've continually spoken about MAGA extremism. Hillary Clinton's even said about debugging and decoding Trump extremists. And to refer to those events of January the 6th as an attempt at insurrection is hysterical hysterical, and it seems to me that, like many crises in recent years, was exploited to legitimize legislation to advance further control and condemnation of an opponent and the movement affiliated with that opponent. That seems more reasonable than that was an attempt to take over the country and run it differently in baseball caps, sort of while smiling, sort of grinning nervously. It's true that the tapes show rioters forcefully entering the Capitol, and some scenes on the tape are not peaceful. It's also true that Trump's rhetoric has at times been inflammatory and illiberal. But inflammatory rhetoric has been present on both sides. If you're continually talking about Hitler, that's about the most incendiary thing you can say about anyone, isn't it? But what the tapes do not show is a coup attempt. Rather, they show many scenes that contradict this narrative, like January 6ers walking calmly down the hallway, Capitol Police appearing completely unfazed by these supposed insurrectionists, and Capitol Police giving the trespassers handshakes. Yeah, because they're broadly speaking pro-police, aren't they? That's the kind of, one might assume, their general stance. So it seems like there's not been an objective appraisal of those events. There's been a highly biased exploitation of those events, which is in keeping with what we understand about 9/11. Like, you know, in this moment, there's not question the origins and how 9/11 was carried out, but what was 9/11 used to facilitate? In this conversation, there's not question the origins of the pandemic, but let's look at how the pandemic was used. Was it used to legitimize regulation, to bring about policies that otherwise would have been impossible, to generate profits? Did it make things economically worse for the vast majority of people while improving the economic conditions of the elite? There's so many clear examples now of how crises of various kinds are exploited to legitimize the agenda of the powerful that it seems sort of almost redundant to keep pointing it out. Despite the evidence that law enforcement at best permitted this coup to take place and at worst facilitated it, January 6 judges have handed down extremely harsh sentences. They sentenced one defendant to 22 years in prison, despite the fact that he wasn't even in Washington, D.C. on January the 6th. You'd think that would be a pretty good alibi. Were you in Washington, D.C. on January 6th? I was not. 22 years! Oh no, Jesus Christ! What's more, the January 6th tapes show scenes that are far less violent than Black Lives Matter riots, which were investigated and prosecuted with much greater lenience, even in cases of arson and assault. We've been able to show many times on our channel how both January 6 protesters and Black Lives Matter protesters were subject to the exploitation of the same surveillance laws, which should be illegal were it not for manipulation of particular clauses that Section 702 permits. But there's no question that these protest movements have been used differently. In our country, about 11 or 12 years ago, there were a bunch of riots, and they prosecuted the people that participated in that riot super fast. They expedited all of the cases, because anything that seems like a threat to the system is often met with a response that shows the ability of authority to crush dissent. Above all, the newly released tapes demonstrate that the Democratic Party's claims to be fighting for democracy and staving off authoritarianism are a sham, and that it's the Democrats who have, in their persecution of Trump and his followers, done more to undermine democracy than Trump ever threatened to do. Elites in the Democratic Party and in the mainstream media, through their efforts to subdue a populist backlash, have eroded First Amendment rights and have politicized the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice. Democrats became everything they once said they feared in Trump: censorial, totalitarian, and corrupt. Their years-long clampdown on dissent and criminalization of political opposition was a systematic attack on liberal democracy. Worse, they became everything that liberals during the 20th century warned Americans about. The Twitter files, the Missouri v. Biden case, and the Facebook files have exposed the lengths to which Democrats went to quash opposition and prevent citizens from exercising the right to protected speech. At the same time as the federal government has pushed for censorship, the FBI under Biden has increasingly become a domestic spying agency, turning its efforts against regular Americans. When whistleblowers step forward to push back against the Bureau's partisan or unethical practices, the FBI retaliates against them. Meanwhile, the Biden's DOJ is inappropriately shielding him and his son from any accountability for their lucrative influence peddling operation. A growing body of evidence suggests that President Biden played a major role in his son's business and that the DOJ is protecting the president from repercussions. This is precisely the type of corruption Democrats warned Trump would bring to the office of the presidency. The Democratic Party and the Biden administration have become precisely what liberals said Trump would be, and they have attacked the foundational principles of our democracy in the name of protecting them. How did this happen?
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
It was extremely demoralizing. Now, let's leave Newsom out of the conversation till later, but it was extremely demoralizing to see somebody like Gretchen Whitmer get rewarded. That people who were, in effect, tortured by some of these governors completely unscientifically. If after all this, Florida has better all-cause mortality numbers than California, that's all the statistic you need to know. And then to observe them getting back in office. Now, you are not just a commentator, but a political candidate. You've been a political candidate a couple times. And as a political candidate, it's your job to be hopeful and optimistic. Explain to me how I should be hopeful and optimistic when Gretchen Whitmer gets reelected.
Well, I'm not sure it's my job as a politician to be hopeful and optimistic. I think it's my job to tell the truth and to have policies that make people better off. By the way, I was just at a party yesterday, Tom, and I met a doctor whom I didn't know. He was a pathologist. And I asked him his opinion about how we handled the COVID crisis. And he said, do you really want to go there? And I said, yeah, I do. I didn't realize he knew who I was and knew that I did not agree with him. And he said, I feel very strongly about this. The COVID vaccine saved lives. I'm very angry about people who say otherwise. And I said, well, not too surprisingly, I feel differently. He said, well, you're not a pathologist. I said, no, and you're not an economist. And I said, there are trade-offs. And he said, well, I don't want to have this conversation anymore. It's when I ran for governor, I was called anti-vax. Now, Tom, I'd been vaccinated because my doctor told me that I should get vaccinated because of my age, because I've got so-called comorbidities. I have high blood pressure. I have a very rare blood disease. And for those reasons, he recommended that I get vaccinated. I followed his advice. In retrospect, I don't believe I would have followed his advice. But my point is, it should not have been mandated. There should not have been vaccine mandates, as there has been in California under Gavin Newsom, mask mandates, as there have been in California under Gavin Newsom. They certainly shouldn't have closed businesses, and they certainly shouldn't have closed schools. Our schools are right near the bottom of all 50 states in America. 75% of Black third graders can either read nor do math at grade level. They lost 2 full years of in-school education, which will translate into earnings loss over the course of their lives. It was the most outrageous response to a pandemic, I think, in the history of the world. And when Gavin Newsom shut down the state, there was a specific date when you weren't supposed to go to work. Because I'm in media at the time, I was exempt. So I got in my car at the same time to go to work. And I thought, Tom, maybe there would be 50% less traffic. Because I thought so many people would say, screw you, I'm going to work. You're not going to tell me what to do, that they would not have enough jails to fill the people who violated the mandate. And after a few days, they would repeal it. I was shocked. I got in my car, and you could have rolled a bowling ball down one of the busiest streets in LA and not hit anybody. I was shocked that so many people simply complied. I was blown away by that. I didn't realize that people were going to be that compliant, act like lemmings, and follow the advice given by somebody who, by the way, kept his own business in operation, Gavin Newsom, had his own kids in school education, while laughing and yucking it up at that restaurant in Napa Valley called the French Laundry with the very same people, Tom, who drafted the mandates. He was not wearing a mask. He was not engaging in social distancing. And they incurred a $12,000 wine tab at taxpayers' expense. I don't know that much about wine, but I assure you he was not drinking Mad Dog 2020. So for all those reasons, I thought that the average person in California would say, the hell with you. You're not going to tell me what to do. You're not going to tell me I can't have a livelihood. A third of all restaurants in the state of California are now gone forever. And these are primarily the mom and poppers owned by Black and brown people, the people that the left purports to care about.
Turn the clock back a bit to earlier in your life. Can you share with my audience what your background is and how it is that you came to hold what we would, I think, legitimately call dissident views?
So it's my long way of saying this, Tom. I was always raised not to be a victim. My mother told me nobody can make you feel inferior without your permission. So I always felt confident. I always felt that if I worked hard, invested in myself, I could make something out of myself. So I was never somebody who said, woe is me, the man is holding me back. I can't say that made me a conservative or libertarian, which I ultimately became, but I was always one of those in my class when the other kids would whine about this or the other. I would give another point of view, a dissident point of view. And I wasn't called a sellout or an Uncle Tom in those days, but I was called somebody, they would roll their eyes, oh, that's Larry, oh, that's Larry. When I would offer a different point of view as to whether or not we were oppressed for this reason or that reason. I went to an all-Black high school. A handful of people were not Black, but most of the kids were Black. And there was a poem we studied in class by a Black poet named County Cullen. And it goes like this. While riding through old Baltimore so small and full of glee, I saw a young Baltimore boy and people looking straight at me. I was young and very small, and he was no whit bigger, so I smiled. But he poked out his tongue, called me nigger. I saw the whole of Baltimore from May until September. Of all the things that happened there, that's all that I remember. The teacher was angry. She was Black. The class was angry. I got angry. So I'm walking home, and I knew my mom was going to have a different perspective on the poem. I didn't know what it was going to be. I walked in the house. She was frying some chicken wings, my favorite, and stirring a big pot of greens. I said, Mom, we read a poem in class. I want to get your reaction to it. She said, sure, what is it? I said, it goes like this. While riding through a Baltimore so small and full of glee, I saw a young Baltimorean, people looking straight at me. I was young and very small, and he was no whit bigger, so I smiled. But he poked out his tongue and called me nigger. I saw the whole of Baltimore from May until September. Of all the things that happened there, that's all that I remember. My mom took the spoon out of the pot, hit it on the side, and said, Larry, what a darn shame he allowed something like that to spoil his vacation. How many wings do you want? So that's always been my attitude, Tom. And then I studied economics, I studied Milton Friedman, I studied Ayn Rand, and I realized that I was, in fact, a hardcore libertarian. And I've been that way ever since.
You run your mouth and I run my business, brother. You tell everybody I'm busted. You talk so much you got me disgusted. But you run your mouth and I run my business, brother.
This was another January 6th video that's come out. in which there's an individual. By the way, that one that I showed of someone looking like they were flashing a badge, I got that 100% wrong. I saw a cleaner image down the line, and he was just showing off his vape pen. Here's another video, though, from the January 6th footage that's been making its rounds. And supposedly in this video, you've got a person, well, there was even a New York Times article. I'm misspeaking here. There's been claims, which was the joke I had made at the beginning of January 6th, that if I was a lawyer or one of these people, I would just say that I'd been pushed. In this video, you got a person who I guess was, curious, just wanted to scope out the door. And then there's a person who's literally pulling people over the line. And here you have, I think, audio of a nice old lady being like, "Why did you pull me in here?" There you go. So we've got some individuals who, even on the day of, are claiming, "Why did you just push me into this building?" And what I think would be the most interesting is really the video footage of who were the people that opened up the doors, opened up the windows. Now you've already got the claims that the crowd was peaceful until they started throwing the stun grenades and whatever else into it. They got it all rallied up and going. But here you have footage of door team open 6 of front lines, people in big time military gear as the first people in, who must have some experience in, I guess, opening up government doors and windows. You would think maybe they would unenforce them, in the days beforehand. But like I said, the most interesting things of the January 6th, I haven't seen these breakdowns yet, are start to finish the people who are now sitting in jail, what they were doing, how they got into the building, what they did while they were in the building. And I think if you could show the sped up version of people peacefully entering the building and along with their prison sentences, I do think that that will be quite persuasive to general people. And then if you can really hone in on who are the people like this, who is that guy who broke in, got the doors open, and do they have relationships with law enforcement? I think we're going to be doing something in terms of getting some of those political prisoners out of jail. I do always like when they have the articles trying to debunk the claims. And in doing so, they're actually just admitting to the claims. So this was from the AP. And if I were to just give you guys the spin up front, because I've seen this more than once, where they basically go, "Well, what you're saying is incorrect because we prefer our more flowery language." Like sometimes they actually get busted red-handed and you go, "Hey, you're advocating for quarantine camps." Or like the same way, "Well, we don't want a lockdown. We just want everyone to stay in their houses for a couple more days." Like sometimes they go, "Well, no, we would never want to strip your freedom. We just want people to be safer. And so as a result, we're going to start turning off everyone's internet at 8 p.m. New York Governor Katie Hochul is trying to create quarantine camps in which people can be held against their will if they have COVID-19 or other diseases. AP's assessment, false. Officials have repeatedly said that the state has no intention to build quarantine camps. By the way, this is like classic in contracts where someone puts something in there and you go, "Hey, you can't have that." "Well, we have no intention of enforcing it." Great, then pull it out. If you've got no intention of enforcing it, then why would we put that there so that you can go enforce it at a later point in time? If you've got no intention of enforcing it, then you can just pull it out and then we don't even need to have a conversation about it. It's classic. It's classic. Yeah. I mean, technically, we went to court and we passed a law so that we could do this to people, but we have no intention of ever doing it. Don't look at all the money and resources we went into getting this whole process done so that we could go enforce this thing because we have no intention of enforcing it. Really? Then why'd you show up to court and why'd you pass the laws if you got no intention of doing it? Let's continue. Officials have repeatedly said that the state has no intention to build quarantine camps. Critics are misrepresenting a temporary rule adopted during the COVID-19 pandemic that outlines powers by state officials to isolate or quarantine people for the purpose of controlling that outlines powers by state health officials to isolate or quarantine people for the purpose of controlling a highly transmissible disease. The rule said that people can be isolated or quarantined in interim housing rather than just their own homes, but doesn't mention camps. Okay, fine. It's not going to be camps, but I'm going to be forcefully held in an area outside of my own home. I mean, fine. All right. I guess you got me on the camp part, but I guess you're admitting to the fact that someone can be quarantined in interim housing. Yeah, I guess New York City doesn't have camps, but I guess you can shove me into one of these homeless hotels, or you can shove me into one of these spots that you've built for, I guess camps is the inaccurate word there. So in other words, you're saying that there is going to be, they did pass a law for forced quarantine. They just have no intention of building camps for it. Sounds to me like you're saying yes. So it's a yes to the forced quarantine part because people weren't too concerned with the camp part. It's like a very, I should have thought of that joke earlier. I can't think of the example, but it's like, yeah, I'll have to come back to that one. I'll have a joke for that one on the next one. It's just such a funny thing to go, "No, we would never do the camp part." No one's cared about the camp part. It's the forced quarantine part. Sounds like I might even prefer if you built me a camp, then you shove me wherever you're placing these, homeless people. isolate or quarantine people for the purpose of controlling a highly transmissible disease. Yeah, of course. I mean, so you're saying, yes, you are doing this, but it's because there's a reason for doing it.
You're listening to Part of the Problem on the Gas Digital Network.
Up until Netanyahu, not of course like waving away any of the brutality of Israel's occupations, but they didn't go on these kind of like bombing campaigns the same way they do now. It was much more special opsy and much more like targeting like the terrorists themselves. Innocent people died. More innocent Palestinians were always dying than innocent Israelis, by very clear difference. But it wasn't the way it's been.
Well, I remember in 2005, our dear leader at antiwar.com, Eric Garris, told me, oh man, now that Sharon is pulling the last of the Jewish settlers out of Gaza, those poor people are doomed. You want to talk about human shields? They were actually shielding the local population, those settlers. And without them there, it's been bloody murder. I forget if Olmert, I think, I think Olmert started a pretty massive campaign in 08, really in 06 too, before Netanyahu came. And, Olmert that's Ehud Olmert. He had been Sharon's right-hand man, and Sharon and Netanyahu had been in Likud together. And then Sharon had split off from Netanyahu and formed Kadima. But he was basically, they're a hair apart on this stuff. Severe differences in choices, I guess, but ideologically very close, right? So I think it might be fair to say that it was Olmert who really started it with these massive campaigns like this. And then Netanyahu has done, and Netanyahu came in, Siri was it early 09, like in the middle of the campaign, I think, of 08, 09, right before Obama was inaugurated. And they finally turned it off 2 days before he was inaugurated. But it went through that winter. And it was Israel that broke that ceasefire, of course. Well, not of course, but it was. And then they did it again in 14, which is the horrible Operation Cast Lead, which, there's this wonderful book by Max Blumenthal called The 51-Day War about that. And they broke that ceasefire too. Oh, it was horrible. Do you know this story? So this is how cynical Benjamin Netanyahu is, dude. Okay. You thought you already knew? And I'm going to say November of 14. Forgive me if I get my month wrong. I believe, or was it in the summer? No. It was in November of 14. On the West Bank, I think it was three Hamas guys had broken out of their pen, crawled over the wall or something, got out. And then they picked up 3 Israeli Jewish hitchhikers. Hey, how are you guys doing? Hop in. Gotcha. And then they killed them. The thing is this, Dave. One of the hitchhikers called 911, whatever the number is. And so they had it recorded. Help us. We've been kidnapped by these Hamas guys. Ah! And then pow, 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 pow. Okay. Netanyahu knows this. These 3 people are not missing. Their bodies are missing. They're dead. They know they're dead. And they know who killed them. They can't find the guys right now, but they know their names. They are 3 individual human men who killed these other 3 individual human men, right? Maybe it was 2 killed the 3. Anyway, Netanyahu leads the people of Israel to believe for more than 2 weeks that these 3 are still missing and presumed alive. And we have no idea who did it. It was one of them dirty Palestinian terrorists. You know how they are. And then sent the cops and the soldiers to run riot throughout the West Bank, killing people, demolishing homes, beating people up and raiding homes in the middle of the night, and pure chaos, pretending to scour the area for these people. And this goes on for more than 2 weeks. And then I think it was some hikers or somebody stumbles upon the shallow grave and finds the bodies. And then Netanyahu goes, oh my God, everybody, they're dead.
There's like IDF soldiers who have defected and stuff like that who tell their stories.
Breaking the silence is what it's called.
Yeah, like and we'll tell you that, like, dude, it's just insane. You're running around there screaming curfew at these people, so they have to get inside their home. If they don't get inside there quick enough, they're pushing grandmas down on the ground and stuff. And I mean, you could just try to put yourself in that situation if you're like a 7-year-old kid and you're seeing some foreign occupying soldier pushing your grandma down on the ground, and then some terrorist group comes along and goes, hey, you want to join? You could totally see them being like, yes, I would like to. But so in 2005 in Gaza, and this is what you were referring to when you said so they did there were some Israeli settlements that were there, and they forced them out. They kind of
Yeah, the
Like,
army basically rooted them out of there.
Well,
came and got
they
them.
paid a lot of them too. Like
Yeah,
it was
sure.
kind of like,
And then
if they wouldn't
demolished
take
the houses they left
if
behind.
they wouldn't take the money, they would. It's kind of what's the what's the term that I'm looking for when they take your house and give you money
Foreclosure.
for it? No, eminent domain.
Yeah.
It's kind of like an eminent domain.
It was,
Thank you.
Look, what they did was they forcefully closed these illegal settlements and withdrew the people out of there.
They got those people out of there, and eminent domain, but even that is by force. You don't have a choice in the matter. So they clear them out, and they end. When they say they end the occupation, they pulled the IDF out of Gaza. So they make it sound like, yeah, well, look, okay, it was an occupation, but we ended the occupation. And then look what they did, in return to thank us for giving them exactly what they wanted. They elect Hamas. And okay, so there's like a lot of issues with that. I did love Sheldon's, the way he put it was, he said it'd be like if all the prison guards left the prison, but they still kept all the doors locked and surrounded the perimeter. Right. And you were like, look, they're free. And you're like, no, that's not what freedom is. That's why, and then it's like, yeah, that's not at all. Like, what is that even? How is this even being spun? And that's why
I was using that same analogy where I was saying, if the West Bank is a minimum security prison where the Palestinian Authority are the trustees in the prison, right, subcontracting for the warden and his men, then in Gaza, Hamas is the strongest gang.
You can't give government the power to force good on the country without also giving it the power to force enormous evils on the country. I saw someone reply to a post that we put up today that talking about how whatever power you give them to do something that you like, just imagine the absolute worst person you can even dream of having that same power and what they might do with it. Because that's who's probably going to have that power eventually. And I think Harry's point is incredibly important. It's incredibly timeless, especially as we live under the largest government in history. If you rely on the monster state to protect you, well, in essence, from itself, to keep you free, despite the fact that it's filled to the brim with absolute monsters, you're going to be really, really, really disappointed in the long run, even if you're not disappointed in the short run. Now, John Jay had a very similar take here that Harry did. This is all the way back in 1788. The first Chief Justice wrote that. Remember that a power to do good always involves a power to do harm. Now, Harry Browne referred to this as the dictator syndrome. And this was, I think, chapter 5, If You Were King, or the dictator syndrome. Harry writes, government grows also because well-meaning people like you and me believe it should do certain things that seem beyond controversy, at least to the average person at least. Find a cure for cancer, stop air pollution, keep violence off television, hold back an aggressor in the Middle East. Man, this is timeless stuff. Something that everyone seems to agree should be done. But should it be done by government? That's my question. And Harry says, I call this the dictator syndrome. You see suffering or danger, and in your imagination, you see a government program eliminating that danger. But in the real world, the program would operate as you expect only if you were an absolute dictator, having at your disposal all the government's power to compel everyone to do things your way. And you are never the one who gets in charge, because if you want to do good things, well, you don't really want to be in government. You don't want to be the person who wields all kinds of power that it shouldn't have. The largest government, the largest empire in history. We don't want to be a part of that. And the people who end up with the power are really not the good guys. I mean, even if they sound good in the short run. And now here's Oliver Ellsworth, third Chief Justice. A power of doing good always implies a power to do evil if the person or party be disposed. Now, ultimately, this all gets down to trust. Federalists like Jay and Ellsworth and many others, they basically were trying to craft a system where you could trust the system. Trust that it would draw only the good people to positions of power and that the people wouldn't have to resort to much, we'll say, stronger things to keep government in check. Now, anti-federalists, and some of the federalists as well, anti-federalists primarily, on the other hand, continually warned about having to trust people with power to do the right thing. Here, for example, old Abraham White in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention, one of my favorite anti-federalist quotes, which is, I wouldn't trust a flock of Moseses. Or Patrick Henry down in the Virginia Ratifying Convention said, if you have a good president, senators, and representatives, there is no danger. But can this be expected from human nature? Instead of trusting no one with power, and that includes the people who tell you trust no one with power. So John Adams, I think, is a great example of this. He says, trust no man with the power to endanger the public liberty. And John Adams, when he had power, well, you couldn't trust him because he endangered the public liberty with the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. That doesn't mean everything else he did was terrible. It's certainly, even Jefferson would have been the same type of thing, but then he was bad with the embargoes from 1807 and beyond. And he even recognized that he went beyond the Constitution in his own view. He was willing to go beyond the Constitution for the Louisiana Purchase, something that he had said some years earlier. He said, to take a single step beyond the limits of the Constitution is to give them a boundless field of power. So one step beyond the limits of what they're authorized to do, even if you like the short-term results, this sets the precedent for other people to go beyond the limits. But most people today, instead of trusting no one with power, they totally trust their team with power. They trust their side of the equation, red or blue. And you can tell by their actions. Going to the federal government and asking the federal government to stop doing what the federal government wasn't even supposed to be doing in the first place is not a people living in the land of the free. These are not the actions of a free people. It's really the actions of a population on its knees begging for permission. John Hancock put it this way in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention. He said, the powers reserved by the people render them secure. And again, it's not just because they're telling government, hey, you're not authorized to do this, and all that stuff that we didn't delegate to you, and, well, you just can't do it, and then they're just going to stop. That's not how it works. Here's how James Iredell put it in the North Carolina Ratifying Convention. He was one of the first associate justices of the Supreme Court. He was a leading Federalist, so he was on the big government side of things, but he wasn't necessarily a Gouverneur Morris or Alexander Hamilton. He wasn't one of those guys who was like an ultra-high nationalist at the time. But he was in favor of more energetic government. Even Jefferson was, certainly over the Articles of Confederation. John Hancock, pretty much most of them really were. Even many of the anti-federalists who opposed ratification. It's not that they loved the Articles of Confederation. Many of them just wanted to see amendments to it. They didn't want to see more indefinite powers, things like the General Welfare Clause, things that could be twisted over time. So anyways, James Iredell put it this way. The only resource against usurpation is the inherent right of the people to prevent its exercise. And if you unpack that, there's so much that you can unpack in this single statement. First of all, usurpation of power is an exercise of power not delegated to the government. As St. George Tucker put it, this is treason against the sovereignty or final authority of the people. So the only thing that can be done to deal with a usurpation of power, not just a good idea, not something to try later, but the only resource is the inherent or natural right of the people to prevent its exercise. That's not the natural right of the people to ask or demand that government stop doing what government wasn't supposed to do in the first place. This is the inherent right of the people to prevent its exercise. So ultimately, if you want to stop government, here's how Iredell followed up. He said the people will resist if the government usurp powers not delegated to it.
So every time the government comes in and says something about, well, we have to regulate this disinformation, they're telling lies and they're doing things, and we have to straighten them out. So we turn to our politicians who are nihilists and they don't even believe in truth. So that's released, and that's where we are today, and trying to figure out, exactly what will happen and what the motivations are in the Middle East. That'd be a miracle if we heard the truth about that. Ukraine, the truth does come out eventually. I mean, it's sort of working its way out in Ukraine because it was such a disaster. It's some of the attention now is given the Middle East between the Palestinians and the Israelis. But to me, Chris, a little bit of truth popped out. I don't know whether it was the Thanksgiving sentiment, but all of a sudden they exchanged prisoners. Well, if people could do that, and all of a sudden exchange these prisoners for their own, reasons. But why can't they do that and just say, well, why don't we quit bombing and killing each other for another year? And maybe they could get used to it. But anyway, I think that there is a systematic approach, an attack on our freedom of speech, the distortion of what speech is, and that the government, when they really want to make it fair and make sure everybody has freedom of speech, believe me, they're a long way off from the strict interpretation of our First Amendment.
Very good, Dr. Paul. Yes, you are correct, of course. Massive lies depend on mass broadcasting, and we have that today. And as you point out, the biggest misinformation people are the politicians and the media, and they work together. They put out the same narrative, this big narrative that they broadcast out, and unfortunately, many people still uncritically accept it. It's like they go to the TV to get their marching orders. And then the usual suspects come out, the big corporations and Hollywood and major sports teams, and then the celebrities are rolled out. So how this works should become obvious to more and more people as time goes on. But we have an advantage, people who at least seek the truth, because that only needs a single person. You don't need mass broadcasting.
But the Zero Hedge had an article yesterday. I want to just quote a little bit from it. It said, "Inside the UN plan to control speech online." Oh, that sounds like a good idea. A powerful United Nations agency has revealed a plan to regulate social media and online communications while cracking down on what it describes as false information. I wonder who will be the judge of false information and other conspiracy theories. You know, in some ways, you know, everybody's conspiring for something. If you get together in the most innocent, honest, positive way of getting 6 people together and start talking, how are we going to shift the momentum away from tyranny toward liberty? Oh, no. Put him in prison. He's a conspirator. We can't let that happen. So this is just terrible. I just think that warmongering and the violence in the world and the attacks on personal liberties has been led by government. That's why government's going to be around for a while longer, and it's been here for a long time. But at the same time, the government is the culprit, and yet they're the ones who are supposed to solve this problem and make sure that people don't obey this. But that's power. I think that. And I've said it for about every year that I've even thought about politics. You need the United Nations, and we can date so many bad things happening since 1945 and the opening up of the door, even the boundaries that they fought over in the Middle East, 20 years ago and lasting for 10 years, and the fighting that's going on in the Middle East. You know, so much of that has been artificially created, by the UN edicts, and I think that is where the real problem is.
To me, they're just a bunch of people that sit around, they come up with totalitarian schemes, and then it gets public relations, a lot of public relations. Their schemes are always way out in the future, 2040, 2050. I mean, life changes so fast. Anyone can make stuff up about 2050. I could do that, but they do it and they have a PR department. I don't. So that's what they do. By the time 2050 comes around, nobody's going to remember what was said back in 2023. But in the end, thank goodness, the UN is toothless. They have no army. They have no taxing power. Each country must submit individually. So the people in those countries have to go along with it. And if a country refuses, they become the Florida. They become the one that proves that the UN scheme is nonsense. So again, you only need one to show the truth of the matter. And that's why all of these schemes of trying to get everybody in the world to go for this one idea is fruitless. It's a fool's errand. But they never stop. They're always coming up with something new, whether it be climate, whether it be gas stoves, you name it. They always have something. I guess it gives them something to do. But like Dr. Paul says, we have something to do too. And that's just to point out the nonsense of their ideas. A lot of people, as conservatives, are afraid of the UN as if the Communist Party is going to take over the world. I'm more afraid of the conservative foreign policy than the toothless UN. The conservative foreign policy, they're already out in the Middle East again. That's scary. So forget about, you always keep an eye on the UN, but don't have the fear that they're, under everyone's bed.
And I think it's very true that it's well known that truth is treason in an empire of lies. When we live in an empire of lies, and so it is very close to treasonous. I imagine. Well, it really is. Think about the people who have suffered about January 6th, and now it's turning out that the videos are showing that there were a lot of lies told about that, and that essentially, insurrection. Those are lies. Truth is treason. And that's what it is. They're saying it is treason, and many people suffer from it. But we need clarity on this, and it can't be provided by the United Nations. It can be provided only by individuals sincerely looking and seeking the truth, realizing that it is liberty that will bring us the maximum amount of peace and prosperity.
There are men regarded today as brilliant economists who deprecate saving and recommend squandering on a national scale as the way of economic salvation. And when anyone points to what the consequences of these policies will be in the long run, they reply flippantly, as might the prodigal son of a warning father, "In the long run, we are all dead." And such shallow wisecracks pass as devastating epigrams and the ripest wisdom. But the tragedy is that, on the contrary, we are already suffering the long-run consequences of the policies of the remote or recent past. Today is already the tomorrow which the bad economists yesterday urged us to ignore. The long-run consequences of some economic policies may become evident in a few months. Others may not become evident for several years. Still others may not become evident for decades. But in every case, those long-run consequences are contained in the policy as surely as the hen was in the egg, the flower in the seed. From this aspect, therefore, the whole of economics can be reduced to a single lesson, and that lesson can be reduced to a single sentence. The art of economics consists in looking not merely at the immediate, but at the longer effects of any act or policy. It consists in tracing the consequences of that policy, not merely for one group, but for all groups. 9/10 of the economic fallacies that are working such dreadful harm in the world today are the result of ignoring this lesson. Those fallacies all stem from one of two central fallacies, or both. That of looking only at the immediate consequences of an act or proposal, and that of looking at the consequences only for a particular group to the neglect of other groups. It is true, of course, that the opposite error is possible. In considering a policy, we ought not to concentrate only on its long-run effects to the community as a whole. This is the error often made by the classical economists. It resulted in a certain callousness toward the fate of groups that were immediately hurt by policies or developments which proved to be beneficial on net balance and in the long run. But comparatively few people today make this error, and those few consist mainly of professional economists. The most frequent fallacy by far today, the fallacy that emerges again and again in nearly every conversation that touches on economic affairs, the error of 1,000 political speeches. The central sophism of the new economics is to concentrate on the short-run effects of policies on special groups and to ignore or belittle the long-run effects on the community as a whole. The new economists flatter themselves that this is a great, almost a revolutionary, advance over the methods of the classical or orthodox economists, because the former take into consideration short-run effects, which the latter often ignored. But in themselves ignoring or slighting the long-run effects, they are making the far more serious error. They overlook the woods in their precise and minute examination of particular trees. Their methods and conclusions are often profoundly reactionary. They are sometimes surprised to find themselves in accord with 17th century mercantilism. They fall, in fact, into all the ancient errors, or would if they were not so inconsistent, that the classical economists, we had hoped, had once for all got rid of.
Separate tech and state. Some libertarians dismiss concerns over social media companies' suppression of news and opinions that contradict select agendas by pointing out that these platforms are private property and not part of the government. There are two problems with this argument. First, there is nothing unlibertarian about criticizing private businesses or using peaceful and voluntary means, such as boycotts, to persuade businesses to change their practices. The second and most significant reason the "they are private companies" argument does not hold water is the tech companies' censorship has often been done at the request of government officials. The extent of government involvement with online censorship was revealed in emails between government and employees of various tech companies. In these emails, the government officials addressed employees of these private companies as though these employees were the government officials' subordinates. Government officials using their authority to silence American citizens is a blatant violation of the First Amendment. Yet some conservative elected officials and writers think the solution to the problem of big tech censorship is giving government more power over technology companies. These pro-regulation conservatives ignore the fact that it would be just as unconstitutional if a conservative administration was telling tech companies who they must allow to access their platforms as it is when progressives order social media companies to deplatform certain individuals. Furthermore, since the average government official's political views are closer to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez than to Marjorie Taylor Greene, giving government more power over social media companies is likely to lead to more online censorship of conservatives. Instead of giving government more power over social media, defenders of free speech should work to separate tech and state. An excellent place to start is pushing for passage of the Free Speech Protection Act. Unlike other legislation such as the Patriot Act and the Affordable Care Act, this bill is accurately named. Introduced by Kentucky Senator Rand Paul and Ohio Representative Jim Jordan, this bill makes it a crime for any federal employee or employee of a federal contractor to use his position to communicate with a social media company to interfere with any American's exercise of First Amendment's protected rights. Violators of this law would face fines of at least $10,000 as well as suspension, demotion or even termination, and a lifetime ban from working with the federal government. In addition to working to pass the Free Speech Protection Act, those who object to the big technology companies' content moderation policies should abandon big tech for more free speech-friendly platforms. Many of the newer social media companies were started to meet the demand for a content moderation-free alternative to the dominant companies. Senator Paul himself stopped posting videos on YouTube because of its suppression of free speech. While My Liberty Report still airs on YouTube, its main platform is Rumble. It is wonderful to do a show on any topic chose without worrying about being canceled. Big tech censorship is a problem created by big government. The solution lies not with giving government more power, but with separating tech and state. Passing the Free Speech Protection Act and making big tech pay a price for cooperating with big government by leaving to use sites like Rumble are two excellent places to start.
So Qatar announced on Monday that Israel and Hamas agreed to extend the truce under the hostage deal for another 48 hours. So a spokesman for Qatar's foreign ministry said, quote, "The state of Qatar announces as part of the ongoing mediation, an agreement has been reached to extend the humanitarian truce for an additional 2 days in the Gaza Strip," end quote. And this was later confirmed by both Hamas and Israel. So this 4-day truce has held since Friday, and the two sides swapped another group of prisoners on Monday. The exchange on Monday included 11 Israeli hostages and 33 Palestinian prisoners. So this exchange fulfilled Hamas's commitment to hand over 50 Israelis during the initial 4-day truce and Israel's commitment to release 150 Palestinians. Hamas has also released 19 other hostages, 17, and that 19 includes 17 Thai hostages, a Filipino, and a Russian dual citizen. And this was part of separate arrangements with these governments. So Qatar did not say what the terms of the 2-day extension are, but Israel has said that it would only extend the truce if Hamas releases 10 Israeli hostages each day. Israel is also required to release more Palestinian prisoners. And this, as far as I understand it, was the basic outline of the agreement that was brokered by Qatar in the first place. So they're kind of going by that, what they initially agreed to for the extensions. So this is kind of an odd story. The U.S. military said that it stopped a ship hijacking in the Gulf of Aden near Somalia on Monday as tensions continue to rise in the region due to Israel's campaign in Gaza. U.S. Central Command said in a press release that the destroyer USS Mason and allied ships responded to a distress call from the Central Park, which is a chemical tanker that's owned by Zodiac Marine. And Zodiac Marine is chaired by Israeli billionaire Eyal Ofer. So it's another Israeli-linked tanker. But this isn't the Houthis, according to the U.S. They say it is most likely the people that tried to hijack this ship were actually Somali. They came from Somalia. This was on the Somali side of the Gulf of Aden. So CENTCOM said that 5 armed individuals attempted to flee the scene on a small boat, but were detained by the U.S. military, so they have them under arrest. And hours after the incident, CENTCOM said 2 ballistic missiles were fired at the USS Mason from Houthi-controlled territory in Yemen, but landed in the Gulf of Aden 10 nautical miles away from the U.S. warship. So the Houthis, formerly known as Ansar Allah, seized an Israeli-linked tanker last week, but the Pentagon said on Monday that the attackers of the Central Park were likely Somali and not Houthi. So Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer vowed in a letter to his colleagues to bring a bill to the Senate floor as soon as December 4th to fund military aid for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. President Biden has requested the funding as part of a massive $105 billion spending package. Schumer said, quote, "One of the most important tasks we must finish is taking up and passing a funding bill to ensure we, as well as our friends and partners in Ukraine, Israel, and the Indo-Pacific region, have the necessary military capabilities to confront and deter our adversaries and competitors. That's why I intend to bring the president's national security supplemental package to the floor as soon as the week of December 4th, end quote. Schumer blamed Republicans for the delay in the passage of the $105 billion behemoth, which was formally requested on October 20th. He said the biggest holdup is, quote, the insistence by our Republican colleagues on partisan border policy as a condition for vital Ukraine aid, end quote. But Biden's request includes a lot of money for the border. It actually includes $13.6 billion for the border, so I'm not sure exactly what the Republicans want. And House Republicans have passed a bill that stripped the over $14 billion allocated to fund Israel's war in Gaza from Biden's $105 billion request. So they took it out. But this bill has been rejected by Democrats because it includes cuts to the IRS, and Schumer has refused to bring it to the floor for a vote in the Senate. Despite this impasse, House Speaker Mike Johnson, Republican from Louisiana, the new speaker, he said on Monday that he is confident and optimistic that Congress will be able to pass funding for both Israel and Ukraine. President Biden has requested $61 billion to fund the proxy war in Ukraine for another entire year, despite Kiev's failed counteroffensive. Johnson said that Israel is a top priority for the U.S. and said Ukraine is also important, but must be tied to border funding. But he's saying we got to keep funding this proxy war in Ukraine. Let's go. We're going to pass it. It's just a matter of, he's basically saying it's just a matter of negotiations with the Democrats. So according to the South Korean Defense Ministry, North Korean soldiers have begun rebuilding military posts along the border. In recent weeks, the relationship between North and South Korea took a further nosedive. Seoul announced that it would partly suspend its participation in a 2018 agreement that demilitarized the border, splitting Korea. Pyongyang then announced its full withdrawal from the deal in response. So South Korea, they released photos that they say is showing North Korean soldiers with arms and others building outposts along the demilitarized zone. Pyongyang destroyed the outpost previously during a period of warming relations between South Korea, North Korea, and the U.S. under the Donald Trump administration. And that was also under President Moon Jae-in in South Korea, who favored Korean unification. Now, President Yoon, who came in last year, vowed to take a very hard line with the North. And Biden is just giving him whatever he wants. Biden even sent a nuclear-armed submarine to South Korea just to wave it in North Korea's face, and obviously China's face as well. Just completely reckless. And tensions continue to rise on the Korean Peninsula.
Your daily dose of Liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
I want to start with a couple questions of my own. And let's start with Paul Krugman. Because Krugman's been saying for quite some time now that he's just baffled that we have a really strong economy that people think is weak because Biden is just very bad at defending himself or making the case. And I think the way I've responded to that is if the economy is really good, I think people wouldn't have to be propagandized into believing that it's good. They would recognize it themselves. So what do you make of this? The economy is actually, I'm sure you've heard this, actually really strong. People are just too dumb to see it.
Yeah, well, first of all, I doubt Krugman would be saying this if Trump were still president and all right. the numbers were identical. So there's so much more politics involved in this than there is real economic analysis. But I don't know that Krugman is even, qualified to do any economic analysis. But as far as, trying to BS that the economy is strong just to try to make Biden look good, clearly, if the economy is strong, you're right, the people don't have to be told the economy is good. They know that it's good. When you have to beat it into their heads and convince them that they're wrong and what they're experiencing is actually strength, even though it feels like weakness. But, the numbers belie these claims of a strong economy, especially the labor market, because all of the evidence supposedly for the strong economy is this great jobs market, this strong jobs market that we have, because we keep creating all these jobs and the official unemployment rate is low. And so we're being told that, the strong economy is a function of the strong labor market, and that's because of Bidenomics, right? Whatever the hell Bidenomics is. But if you actually look at what's going on, why are we creating all these jobs? Well, because people can't survive on their primary job, and so they need to supplement their income by moonlighting, and they take on second jobs and third jobs. Pretty much all the jobs that Biden has created have been for people who already had a job. Now, most people don't want 2 or 3 jobs. In fact, they don't even want one job. If they could get a paycheck without working, they would sign up for that. So people work because they have to. And so the fact that they have to work a lot harder now and for a lot more hours isn't a sign of a strong labor market. It's the sign of a weak labor market.
Well, let's stick for a second with our favorite New York Times columnist. He shared a chart maybe about a month ago, and it was tracking the CPI in the U.S. and then tracking the CPI in the Eurozone countries, and they more or less track each other closely. And that was his attempt to say that there's no way this is the Biden regime's, Biden administration's problem, because it's happening everywhere.
Yeah. Look, yes, because everybody made the same mistake, right? Everybody printed too much money. And if you look at the monetary and fiscal policies in the Eurozone, they're very similar to the monetary and fiscal policies over here. And so it makes sense that we're experiencing the same consequences of the same policy. So it doesn't let Biden and the Fed off the hook just because the ECB and the Bank of England and their governments we're, playing from the same playbook. We're all experiencing the predictable consequences of that policy. Krugman was the guy that said, we don't have to worry about inflation. And he took a premature victory lap years ago, proclaiming that all the guys like me or like you who were warning about inflation, we were all wrong. Well, all the inflation that he said wasn't going to happen, it's happened. And he just doesn't understand that there was a long lag between the creation of the inflation and the manifestation of that inflation in a more noticeable and harmful way in the CPI. When that inflation was making its way into the economy and was stopping in stocks and bonds and real estate and other assets, nobody really cared about the inflation because it was inflating the prices that people like to see go up. But now that all that inflation is in consumer prices, and of course, the inflation that was created during COVID was immediately injected right into the economy because it didn't pass through the financial banks and the assets. It went right into people's pockets and immediately went out of those pockets as they spent it. And so we had a big boost in the measured inflation rate. But I still think we have a long way to go to catch up to all the inflation that's in the pipeline. So I think we've experienced the beginning of the adjustment in prices, but prices still have a long way to rise to adjust for the increase in money supply.
Nevertheless, though, you're right about his premature victory lap. And now he's been trying to say, again, since about a month ago, that excluding several major categories of items, food, energy, shelter, used cars, stuff like that, that actually it's now back to price inflation is now back to manageable levels. So it was a problem, but now it's behind us.
Yeah, well, I guess the problem is when you're having to spend so much money on food and energy and insurance and stuff like that, you have nothing left over for the other stuff. So I guess the other stuff is going down in price because people can't afford to buy it anymore because the stuff that they're buying has gone up so much in price. But obviously, that's only temporary because the supply of those goods is going to shrink and then the price will go back up. But maybe there's a little bit of relief now. But of course, what nobody wants to point out, even if those prices are rising more slowly now, they're still rising from the elevated levels. So if you have prices go up 10, 15, 20% over a couple of years, and then they only go up 2 or 3%, that's on top of all the prior increases. So there's no relief coming. Nobody is talking about rolling back the price hikes.
Know him, Michael, but I'm supporting for president, Michael Rechtenwald.
I don't know him.
So Michael Rechtenwald is he's a presidential candidate seeking the Libertarian Party nomination. He was a college professor for years who got into trouble with the woke mob and then got found like Mises and Rothbard and Hoppe and stuff like that. And became
Tom,
like
I think, was a big part of that.
Yes, that's correct.
And he's been working with the Mises Institute for years now and doing podcasts and writing articles for them. So he he was with a publisher that's published his last like 5 books.
But it's a minor little college. I never even heard of them.
What?
The publisher he has.
Oh, is it? Okay.
His advance must have been like $3,000. I don't know.
I don't know
the tiny little
details of that.
Okay.
From what I understood, it was a bigger thing that he lost than that. But I don't know the details of it. But they were like a kind of right-wing, anti-cancel culture.
Oh, then I thought it was some kind of university press.
No.
Are you
going
to mention who else dropped him?
Well, I don't know that, so I won't mention it, but I would like to hear you mention it. But let me just give the story, because from what I understand, this was like $100,000 type thing.
Oh, then I'm talking to my ass. Sorry.
So they've published his last 5 books, which have all been very critical of the woke mind virus, of COVID insanity, of big tech censorship, things like that. So they've been all on board with this anti-cancel culture thing. And then he came out against the Israeli war in Gaza, and they dropped him for it and basically called him an anti-Semite.
Oh, wow.
And like, so anyway, it was just there's several things there, but obviously one of them is that.
Name them. Who's this publishing house? Because I'd never heard of them. And I thought I assumed just from the name that they were fringe.
I could find it.
I don't recall.
Because that's important, because it's not, who's the one that that Tom had, the World of Conservatives had, who's
Regional or something like that?
Regnery.
Regnery.
They're not Regnery.
Yes, they're not Regnery. All right, hold on. So what were you going to say, Angela? What's the other one?
Well, the other one, it appears, I believe I heard him say this on a live stream, that he was teaching courses at Hillsdale.
Hillsdale cancel him?
Right.
And they want to part ways with him too.
I did hear that. I don't know if that's like official or not, but I heard that was a thing. Yeah.
So, my perspective on that is, rather than to blow them up and send them a bunch of hate mail and tell them how much they suck, we should write to them and say, like, please don't do this. This is a bad decision. But you need to support him.
I think he is, and this is one of the reasons I'm sure you didn't run. I think he was naive. I'm surprised it's coming from these quarters and this early, but there was no doubt in any of our minds in this room, and I'm sure in his, that if he got any traction as a libertarian candidate for president, the consequences for him and his family personally would not be minor.
Yeah.
It's very true.
It's a difficult situation when it's kind of like the better you do, the more in jeopardy you are, or the more, it don't upset you, Michael, but it is amazing how much they'll be like, it's like all the pro-Israeli people are like, have you seen what's in Hamas's charter? Did you see what these people were chanting in the street? Did you see what they're saying? And you're like, yeah, but Benjamin Netanyahu just literally compared this to a biblical fight. And Lindsey Graham is saying flatten Gaza and like all these things. Like these people in very powerful positions are literally making these claims that like, if you said this about any other group of people, you'd be like, whoa, holy shit. And in fact, by the way, I do think that about what's in Hamas's charter and like what some of these people in protest are saying too is like fucking insane. But you're just like, yeah, why is it like people get into this tribalistic like attitude where their side saying that is completely acceptable?
It should
for
give
whatever
you
reason.
pause. Everybody should just mentally like, oh, maybe something's up here.
Well, it gives me concern because I don't see a stable route towards peace if you have two sides who say you do not have a right to exist. And like, where do you go with that? It's so, and I compared it, I forgot what show it was on, I compared it to the whole North Korea situation and the Korean War, where you have Kim Il-sung, who is the devil, and you have Syngman Rhee in the South Korea, who's not a nice guy. And then but you had Mao and Stalin in the North, you have the US and you in the South, and it's the Korean people who pay the price. And that doesn't mean Syngman Rhee is good, doesn't mean Kim Il-sung is good, doesn't mean these people aren't evil terrorists. It's just like, but what ends up happening is countries get leveled and lots of innocent people die. By the way, my favorite take on this, and shout out to Tom on this, because he had this tweet about how, all this is awful going on. Oh, but it's just okay for Israel to go in and just level all these like hospitals and schools. And it's just like, are you on the side of Hamas or are you on the side of Israel? I'm a libertarian. I'm on the side of the buildings. I looked at that, I'm like, this is literally the most libertarian tweet I've ever seen. Has anyone worried about the private property?
That is great.
Man, that was really hilarious.
It's a very neutral take.
Well, it's it's interesting. One of the things that's been kind of fascinating over the last couple weeks, and of course this happens all the time. I mean, I couldn't even count up the examples of this over the last just few years, but how much like there's this complete propaganda narrative, and then on a dime it stops. And now it's so Orwellian, like it's just like, oh, this has always been the case. But so I remember many people, because I've been talking about the Ukraine war when I've been on Rogan like the last 3 times. And so many people have called me, Putin apologist, spewing Russian propaganda. Dave is pro-Putin is what they say all the time, which like, I will say, when I'm critical of Israel, I do feel like this need to put a disclaimer on it, but I never felt the need with Ukraine because that, like, the accusation of being a Putin supporter is just so stupid on the face of it. Like, there is not one American who is sworn loyal to Vladimir Putin. That just
I think you're wrong. I think a lot of these tradcons like him because of how anti-LGBT he is.
Maybe there's some people who like that about him, but it's not. But even that isn't really like a Putin loyalist. But when you're talking,
they would prefer Putin to Kamala Harris as president.
Well, we'd have to sit down and have a real debate about that. I don't know, Putin, Kamala Harris. This is a pretty tough choice. Right? We only have so much time on this podcast. Michael, I don't know.
Yeah,
Kamala or Putin.
Wow,
yeah,
that is a good way to put it.
Kids and laughed about it.
Yes.
Putin's never laughed about it.
But when I'm talking about Israel, I do feel more of a need to be like, okay, listen, and I'm not like, there are people who hate Jews. I'm not one of those people. You know what I mean? Yeah. I'm just being critical of the Israeli government. But like, I do see enough of that I'm like, okay, let me just like make it clear that like I'm not coming from that perspective. Anyway, so
what is your solution there, though?
The solution for Israel and Palestine? Well, I mean, like, I can tell you what I think the solution is, but then like actually getting to that would probably require a whole new generation of leadership that isn't the Likud party, that isn't Hamas.
It's a long road.
Okay, that's very fair.
But if you're going to examine the problem with Israel and the Palestinians, and you're not going to start with the acknowledgement that the way Israel was created was by forcefully taking a whole bunch of shit that had been owned by the Arabs and really forcefully evicting them by the hundreds of thousands, and that ever since 1967, they have been occupying in one form or another these Palestinians. All the way, they won a war in 67 and just determined they can occupy them and subjugate them forever. And if you're not going to look at that, you're never even going to be looking at what the situation is. And I think there's I don't remember the quote off the top of my head. Maybe you will. I think it's an Abraham Lincoln quote, and it was about ending slavery. And he said something about how like we've got the tiger by the.
That's not Lincoln. You sure it's Lincoln?
No, maybe I'm wrong.
I don't think Lincoln's a tiger talker.
But anyway, it was something like we can't let him go and we can't keep him. You know what I mean? Like and I think the feeling from the Israeli side is like, well, we can't take our boot off their neck or they're going to lash out at us.
But they're not wrong.
Well, they may not be wrong, but but then that's a different conversation.
It is a
different
conversation.
But you've got to take your boot off of their neck because you just don't have a right to do it anymore.
But so listen, can we switch gears a little bit in the last few minutes here to your real speciality, which is America's relationship with Russia and, of course, currently the horror show taking place in Ukraine. Now, almost 2 years into it. It's unbelievable, isn't it? Can you tell us? Go ahead. Anything on your mind there?
It's just so unbelievable because it's something that didn't have to happen. And a lot of people like us, we're saying it didn't have to happen. This could have come to a peaceful settlement. But, Washington insisted on taking a different path. And so now we're approaching 500,000 Ukrainian casualties and probably very likely over 100,000 Russian casualties. And what you have is the wholesale destruction of the Ukrainian state, which is now going to be really nothing more than a rump state. And what we're going to have is a division of Europe running through Ukraine. None of this had to happen. There were alternatives. And the alternatives were refused, and those of us who floated alternatives were, constantly smeared. as being Russian apologists and Putin puppets and unpatriotic or whatever. So it's a horrible, horrible tragedy. But I have a feeling that history is going to repeat itself, in that the people who were most enthusiastic in pursuing the war policy aren't going to pay a price at all. The same thing is going to happen that happened after Iraq. No one's going to pay any reputational price at all, and that's another tragedy because we never really seem to learn from our mistakes. I have a new piece up on antiwar.com today that talks about the role that the members of the Israel lobby play in the administration and in shaping the administration's policy.
Oh, really? I'm so sorry I missed that, man. I'm at least a day or a week behind on everything. James, you want to talk about that? Please do.
Well, it's interesting. Last week, Joe Biden, because he doesn't have a Secretary of State that actually knows what he's doing, he's been relying on people like William Burns and other people to deal with the heavies in the Middle East. And last week, he sent over a guy who's not very well known outside of Washington. He's Biden's senior advisor for energy policy. And his name is Amos Hochstein. And I thought it was interesting that the more I dug into his background, the more kind of trouble I got. Hochstein isn't an American. He was born and raised in Jerusalem. He served in the IDF. And then after a short stint at a PR agency in Tel Aviv, he came to the United States and went right to Capitol Hill and landed a gig. And in a very short order, was one of the staff directors to the House Foreign Affairs Committee. There's no record of Mr. Hochstein having gone to a university or any sort of academic or real-world expertise in energy policy, but he goes from the IDF to Capitol Hill and then right up the ladder, right up the greasy pole in Washington. And he found himself as head of the energy portfolio during the Obama administration at the U.S. State Department. It seems at a minimum to be sort of odd that we have a Israeli representing the United States government during these negotiations. He was sent over by Biden this week to try to head off a expansion of the war between Israel and Lebanon. So things like that don't get a lot of attention here, but I think that
is really strange. I mean, if you said
it is odd, and I did run. I approached the State Department, just questioning, who is this guy? What's his background? What's his education? They refused to answer me, even though they of course have all the information on him because he worked for the State Department for over 6 years. I did run the story by a very well-known Middle East hand in Washington who knows all the Obama, Biden, Middle East players. He seemed to signal that he did signal that I was on the right track. I wasn't being unfair. It's sort of troubling. It's sort of troubling that we have someone who, and this fellow's parents still live in Jerusalem. So he may well be an American citizen and he may well be a loyal one, but there is such a thing as the appearance of conflicts of interest here. And it would seem that he has those. And of course, as I point out, after he was done overseeing the energy portfolio at the State Department under Obama and Clinton, he ended up, surprise, surprise, with a board seat on a Ukrainian gas and oil company.
Mm-hmm. Well, and after he went over there, Israel bombed Lebanon more and killed civilians and journalists more.
So anyway, that's up at Anti-War.
Welcome to Liberty Lockdown. Please scan your barcode. Your liberty ain't gone, but yeah, it's on hold.
I unfortunately received a strike on my YouTube channel just today, earlier this morning, and it is for my QAnon shaman, aka Jacob Chansley, interview that I did 3 months ago. The segment that they told me endorsed violence was in fact not at all that. I did appeal, and within, I'd say, 60 seconds of my appeal, they responded instantaneously saying, no, we've already reviewed thoroughly, and you have absolutely endorsed violence, which I did not do. Absolutely did not do. If you guys recall, I know it was 3 months ago, so you may not remember, but we ended that with like a 5-minute guided meditation by the shaman. That's, that's really endorsing violence there, I guess. So I'm very frustrated. But thank goodness for Rumble. Thank goodness for Twitter, aka X. And I'll just continue to encourage you guys, subscribe over on Rumble, spread the word, share it with people. I have 30 days that I cannot publish to YouTube. Nothing I can do about it. But that's the deal. So let's get into it.
As a powerful stranglehold on the American government. They control both members of the House and the Senate. They have us involved in wars of which we have little or no interest. Our children are coming back in body bags. Our nation is bankrupt over these wars. And if you open your mouth, you get targeted. And if they don't beat you at the poll, they'll put you in prison.
Explain to me what you see as, why you target or why you have a grudge against the Israelis.
The grudge is not necessarily a grudge. It's an objective assessment that no one will have the courage to speak about. They're controlling much of our foreign policy. They're influencing much of our domestic policy. Wolfowitz, as Undersecretary of Defense, manipulated President Bush #2 back into Iraq. They pushed definitely to try and get Bush before he left to move into Iran. We're conducting an expansionist policy of Israel, and everybody's afraid to say it. They control much of the media. They control much of the commerce of the country. And they control powerfully both bodies of the Congress. They own the Congress.
Are you an anti-Semite?
No, I'm not. That's exactly what they're going to say. And I expect that. What I am is an American. You see, I think America comes first. And we have a one-sided foreign policy in the Mideast. And we've alienated Arabs who have no way of fighting. So what they've done, and I predicted this on the House floor, is they would export violence to America. And they have. They have no other way to fight. I think President Obama knows this. I think he sees this. I think he wants to do something. I think his hands are tied. And I think he's dancing between the raindrops, trying to figure how I can politically machinate some scenario to mitigate these problems. Greta, I'm saying this. America is in danger if America doesn't take back the government without foreign interference.
That is Congressman James Traficant. He died in a tractor accident September 27, 2014, shortly after that interview. And seeing as I'm suspended from YouTube, I can play that clip and actually tell you what I think about it. Because I wouldn't feel safe to do so over on YouTube, that's for sure. I think he's telling the truth, okay? I think he's telling the truth. And as he said, no, it doesn't make him or I or anyone else that just sees the reality for what it is an anti-Semite. What it makes you is someone who's actually paying attention to what's actually happening and who's manipulating our political strings. And as he pointed out, it was Undersecretary Wolfowitz that did, in fact, play a huge role in getting the war on terror started. That's not about him being Jewish. It's about it being for Israeli interests as opposed to American interests. And I'm going to stop with all of the disclaimers and just talk about this because I think it's ridiculous that I have to disclaim everything and just say any foreign country that has that level of control over your political establishment is not benign. It's a bad thing. Do you want to have politicians who listen to other nations above your own interests as someone who's actually paying taxes to this government? Well, the answer ought to be, obviously, fuck no. That's not what I want. So, Mr. Traficant, who, I don't know if it's Traficanti, but I think it's Traficant, who was imprisoned and then died in a unceremonious fashion in 2014, I think he was probably telling the truth. And I'll leave it to you to decide if he died of natural causes or of that tractor accident. But there's a lot of danger that comes with speaking out about this stuff, unfortunately. And let me be very clear, not at all suicidal, just went to the doctor, perfect bill of health. So yeah, I'll just leave it at that. I am disturbed at the extent of foreign influence on our government. I don't like our government in the first place, but I really don't like the government when it works at the behest of foreigners. Because I'm the one that's paying these motherfuckers to go and start wars on behalf of Israel. That doesn't seem very fair now, does it? Not to mention, it then creates blowback against the American people because we're over there doing the bidding of a nation that isn't ours. And as he said, we're alienating the entire Arab world and the Muslim world. Upwards of 30% of the global population doesn't like America because of who we are in bed with. And in reality, I think who largely runs our government. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me that that's somehow hateful of Jewish people, which, by the way, I love Jewish people. Like, all of my influence are Jewish. Like, almost all of them. So, yeah, that ain't it.
But Chris, I believe that the true libertarian society are the real environmentalists, because if you own the property, nobody has a right to mess with it and pollute it or destroy your property, and people should be punished by it. So it's the collusion of big government and big business that gets together and have abused, the environment and what has happened over the many, many years. And there's truth to that, but it won't be solved by just saying, what we need are more regulations. And Chris, I think that's what they're doing here. More regulations. They want to have healthy people, and we've got to tell them how much meat they're allowed to eat. And besides, that can destroy the farmers. Oh, that's okay. The farmers pollute 33% of all the pollution in the country. We have to get rid of it. Well, how are they going to eat if you don't have farmers? Oh, we never thought of that. So we'll have to think of that. We want you to think about the ramifications of these stupid things that government does. The bigger the government, the worse the ideas are. So I would say self-government, you make mistakes for oneself. And I would say local government makes mistakes. But I'll tell you what, it's the best system you can have is close government. But the bigger the government is, the more international it is, the more globalist it is, the worse the problems are, the bigger the solutions, and the less freedom we have.
But speaking of history, throughout all of human history, humans have struggled simply to eat, let alone meat. Meat was like hitting the jackpot. And we go to the supermarket and it's all laid out for us, but we have it so good and nobody, again, knows the history. Wealthy nations would eat meat, and the poor, they're called third world nations, they suffer with much, much less, if at all. But these are the authoritarians. They hate middle-class people. They hate people that rise up and are able to sustain themselves, because you're supposed to live at their beck and call, not be independent, eating what you want. So they say, no, you'll eat insects instead. We'll grow meat in the lab for you. And, they're trying this stuff, and the people obviously do not want it. When you look at the stocks of Beyond Meat and some of the other ones, the people don't want this stuff. You want real food. So now if somebody doesn't want to eat meat voluntarily, fine. That's what freedom is all about. Eat what you want. It's nobody's business, especially the UN, to tell us and then try to cloak it in science after COVID. I mean, who believes anything is for science after COVID? So fortunately, the UN is like a big PR firm for the globalists. We don't have to listen to them. Hopefully, Americans, I don't think they would ever give up meat for the United Nations.
Right. There's a famous quote out of history during the French Revolution when Marie Antoinette was quizzed, but what will the people eat? And if we don't provide this and that, and her comment was, if there's no bread, let them eat cake. And that's been the accuracy, the exact accuracy of that quote sometimes is a question, but it makes a very strong point. That is the attitude of most politicians. Yeah, we're going to do that. We're going to wreck with their system. They're all going to lose their jobs, but, well, let them apply for food stamps. Something like that. They're totally cavalier about it. And this is what has gone on. And, there's going to be a lot of problems from this. But, Chris, I really don't believe the people who are the leaders who come up with these crazy ideas are the ones that are going to suffer. If you look at one as sort of, the missionary for all this radical environmental stuff is Kerry, former Senator Kerry, who works for Biden now. He doesn't, he was so arrogant when they said, yeah, but what about when you fly your jet airplane all the place? Your carbon, the carbon you're creating is far above any average person. He had an easy answer. He says, but I'm important. I have to get there and get to these meetings and plan how we're going to save the people. So I am much better. If anybody looks at that statement, it's amazingly arrogant, because most of the time they try to hide their arrogance. But one thing good I think that came out of the COVID lockdown was, whenever somebody locally or internationally came up with a regulation which made no sense and caused more trouble than good, and when they were exposed as never following the regulations they wrote, the people rebelled against that. That's finally what cracked that whole system, is because the people who wrote it. But that might be a general rule of politicians. I mean, if they write rules against us for any reason, they don't expect that they have to do it. They are dictatorial, and they will have their own life. And that is the reason why the most important thing we do in moving a political system is take the power away from the government, because they do not represent the people. They buy their way into office, and then they control us, and they're the ones who think they can always escape. But eventually, hard times comes, violence comes, people get a little bit angry. It's preventable if we just wise up and modify our system of authoritarianism. Chris?
Absolutely, Dr. Paul, and you hit it right on the head, arrogance. And globalism really is peak arrogance. because they tend to view all of humanity as just a bunch of, animals that they herd. They believe it's their job to be in charge of feeding us, of educating us. Who do we interact with? Where do we travel? Are we allowed to travel? Maybe they'll put a kill switch in a car. And Congressman Massey has been fighting that. Some are even eugenicists. They go even further. They believe they should be in charge of how people should reproduce and who should reproduce. And they have the audacity, many people, to say that there's just too many people in the world. They know how many people there should be and what the weather should be and how the climate should change. I mean, this really is peak arrogance. They're not acting as people. They are pretending to be God. And isn't that the original sin? I mean, whether or not you believe in Adam and Eve, at least get the lesson from it. That was it. It was not knowing your place in this world. And the globalists do not know their place in this world. And they're really just wrecking things for everybody.
It is often sadly remarked that the bad economists present their errors to the public better than the good economists present their truths. It is often complained that demagogues can be more plausible in putting forward economic nonsense from the platform than the honest men who try to show what is wrong with it. But the basic reason for this ought not to be mysterious. The reason is that the demagogues and bad economists are presenting half-truths. They are speaking only of the immediate effect of a proposed policy or its effect upon a single group. As far as they go, they may often be right. In these cases, the answer consists in showing that the proposed policy would also have longer and less desirable effects, or that it could benefit one group only at the expense of all other groups. The answer consists in supplementing and correcting the half-truth with the other half. But to consider all the chief effects of a proposed course on everybody often requires a long, complicated, and dull chain of reasoning. Most of the audience finds this chain of reasoning difficult to follow and soon becomes bored and inattentive. The bad economists rationalize this intellectual debility and laziness by assuring the audience that it need not even attempt to follow the reasoning or judge it on its merits because it is only classicism or laissez-faire or capitalist apologetics or whatever other term of abuse may happen to strike them as effective. We have stated the nature of the lesson and of the fallacies that stand in its way in abstract terms. But the lesson will not be driven home, and the fallacies will continue to go unrecognized unless both are illustrated by examples. So let us begin with the simplest illustration possible. Let us, emulating Bastiat, choose a broken pane of glass. A young hoodlum, say, heaves a brick through the window of a baker's shop. The shopkeeper runs out furious, but the boy is gone. A crowd gathers and begins to stare with quiet satisfaction at the gaping hole in the window and the shattered glass over the bread and pies. After a while, the crowd feels the need for philosophic reflection, and several of its members are almost certain to remind each other, or the baker, that after all, the misfortune has its bright side. It will make business for some glazier. As they begin to think of this, they elaborate upon it. How much does a new plate glass window cost? $100? That will be quite a sum. After all, if windows were never broken, what would happen to the glass business? Then, of course, the thing is endless. The glazier will have $100 more to spend with other merchants. And these, in turn, will have $100 more to spend with still other merchants. And so, ad infinitum. The smashed window will go on providing money and employment in ever-widening circles. The logical conclusion from all this would be, if the crowd drew it, that the little hoodlum who threw the brick, far from being a public menace, was a public benefactor. Now let us take another look. The crowd is at least right in its first conclusion. This little act of vandalism will in the first instance mean more business for some glazier. The glazier will be no more unhappy to learn of the incident than an undertaker to learn of a death. But the shopkeeper will be out $100 that he was planning to spend for a new suit. Because he has had to replace a window, he will have to go without the suit, or some equivalent need or luxury. Instead of having a window and $100, he now has merely a window. Or, as he was planning to buy the suit that very afternoon, instead of having both a window and a suit, he must be content with the window and no suit. If we think of him as a part of the community has lost a new suit that might otherwise have come into being. It is just that much poorer. The glazier's gain of business, in short, is merely the tailor's loss of business. No new employment has been added. The people in the crowd were thinking only of two parties to the transaction, the baker and the glazier. They had forgotten the potential third party involved, the tailor. They forgot him precisely because he will not now enter the scene. They will see the new window in the next day or two. They will never see the extra suit, precisely because it will never be made. They see only what is immediately visible to the eye.
So as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's political career is in peril due to his failure to prevent the October 7th Hamas attack on southern Israel, the Israeli leader has been meeting with members of his Likud party to ensure continued support. According to Israeli media, in these meetings, Netanyahu has sold himself as the only one who can prevent the creation of a Palestinian state and stand up to pressure from the Americans. Netanyahu told Likud lawmakers, according to Israel's Khan public broadcaster, quote, "I am the only one who will prevent a Palestinian state in Gaza and the West Bank after the war," end quote. So I have to mention, Netanyahu has been coming under a lot of fire from his political opponents in Israel over his previous comments and his previous stance on Hamas, this strategy of propping up Hamas to separate the Palestinians in Gaza from the West Bank, the idea to prevent a unified Palestinian movement that seeks its own state. And, this is something in the U.S., people call you a conspiracy theorist if you bring it up. But in Israel, there's a very robust conversation about this. Right after the October 7th Hamas attack, there was articles, I know there was one in the Times of Israel, that said Netanyahu's strategy to prop up Hamas has failed. So there's been some more talk within Congress about conditioning aid to Israel. But Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky, he dismissed the growing calls to condition military aid to Israel, calling them ridiculous, as Israel has been killing civilians at a historic pace in Gaza. McConnell said, quote, "Our relationship with Israel is the closest national security relationship of any country in the world, and to condition, in effect, our assistance to Israel on their meeting our standards, it seems to me, is totally unnecessary," end quote. So while the majority of Congress staunchly backs Israel and would not want to place limits on U.S. military support, there have been growing calls from some Democrats, as well as Bernie Sanders, who is an independent, to put conditions on U.S. aid. Sanders wrote in the New York Times last week, quote, "The United States must make clear that while we are friends of Israel, there are conditions to that friendship, and that we cannot be complicit in actions that violate international law and our own sense of decency," end quote. So according to The Intercept, Sanders said that he might push for a vote on conditioning the over $14 billion that President Biden is seeking to fund Israel's war in Gaza. So apparently he might put something to the floor saying that $14 billion is conditioned on certain things. I doubt that would have any chance of passing, but it's good to see at least there is some growing calls like this in Congress, although Sanders is still, you can't really ever have faith in him. If you remember last year, he was supposed to bring this Yemen war powers resolution to the floor, and then the White House talked to him, and he decided to drop it. And he never brought it back up, despite claiming that he would. So Thomas Massie, Republican, a good Republican from Kentucky, unlike McConnell, he was the lone member of the House to vote against a resolution equating criticism of the modern state of Israel with anti-Semitism. So the resolution passed in a vote of 412 to 1 to 1 and 1. Massie voted no. Rashida Tlaib voted present, but Massie was the only one to vote against it. And the bill states that the House reaffirms the state of Israel has the right to exist and recognizes that denying Israel's right to exist is a form of anti-Semitism. So Massie explained his opposition in a post on X. He said, quote, "I agree with the title, reaffirming the state of Israel's right to exist, and much of the language, but I'm voting no on the resolution because it equates anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is deplorable, but expanding it to include criticism of Israel is not helpful," end quote. So Tlaib said she did not vote in favor of the resolution because it ignores the existence of the Palestinian people, was how she put it, and brings us no closer to peaceful coexistence. So the resolution states that the Jewish people are native to the land of Israel, but it does not mention that the modern state of Israel was founded mainly by Jewish European immigrants who drove over 700,000 native Palestinian Arabs out of the land in 1948. So Massie has voted against other Israel-related legislation, including a bill to give Israel $14.3 billion more in military aid to support its war in Gaza. For his position, Massie has been targeted by the Israel lobby. They've run ads smearing him as a disgrace. He responded to this a few weeks ago and said, quote, "Why does Israel historically get more foreign aid than any other country? Because they have the most aggressive lobbyists working for them. I voted not to send another $14.3 billion overseas, so now they're running ads on radio, TV, and Facebook. I won't vote to give them your dollars, end quote. So NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg on Tuesday urged alliance members to continue funding the proxy war in Ukraine amid growing signs that Western support for the conflict is waning. Stoltenberg told reporters, quote, "We just have to stay the course. This is also about our security interests," end quote. And he said this ahead of a meeting of NATO foreign ministers in Brussels. So the NATO chief acknowledged that the battle lines have barely moved in the past year as Ukraine's counteroffensive has failed, and he justified continuing support based on the damage that's been done to Russian forces. Stoltenberg said, quote, "We have also to take into account that even though the front lines has not moved so much, the Ukrainians have been able to inflict heavy losses on the Russian forces with deep strike capabilities with cruise missiles delivered by NATO allies," end quote. So it sounds like they're trying, the goal of this, the whole point of this was to, weaken Russia, which we've heard before.
Here's Gerald Celente with today's trends in the news.
Censorship is the American way. Censorship from the fucking dickheads, and I can't say the other word, that slaughter millions of people across the globe that cost us hundreds probably of trillions of dollars in the name of freedom and democracy as they rob it from us. Look at the little clown you got there now running the House Speaker. House speaks a shit. Mike Johnson. Oh, I'm an evangelical Christian. Oh, I hate abortion, but let's keep sending more money to slaughter those Palestinians. Oh, the big news on CNN about Hamas releasing this young girl is the big story. Big story about Hamas releasing this girl and what the girl said to her father. But nothing about, here it is. First on CNN, father describes how his young daughter, Emily Hand, survived Hamas captivity. How about first on CNN, father describes how his wife and children survived in the deadly prisons that the Israelis locked up thousands of innocent Palestinians. No, you only hear of the Hamas taking the people, but Israel could take anybody that they want, do anything they want, and kill anybody they want. And all you fucking scumbags, do not call me anti-Jewish or anti-Semite. Fuck you. It has nothing to do with it. I'm not anti-American. I just said, how dare Americans slaughter all those people all over the fucking world in the name of freedom and democracy when they didn't do anything to us. Many newspapers don't have a single reporter. That's right. They've been brought up by all these chains and they just repeat the same crap. Gannett fired 600 reporters, journalists, this year. One after another. We're giving you what nobody's giving you. So now on the economic front, again, you go back to November, we said, the markets would go up, and they did. We said the S&P would climb at least 16.3%, and it went more than that, almost 20, backed off now. Then in July, at the beginning of July, we said markets are going to go down in September and October. They did. And now we're saying, watch out for December. Hey, you see those gold prices? Who forecasted better than we did? Go back in 2022. We said last September, gold bottomed. It went way up, and then when it was going down again, we said this year when it hit around 1850, it bottomed. And each week in the Trends Journal, we're giving you our gold forecast, and right on the money. You know what it is today? It hit 242. Excuse me, 2042. Not 242. 2042. It was down as low as 1830s. And what did we say? They're going to lower interest rates. The only reason the dollar is strong is because interest rates are high. When they lower interest rates, the dollar's going down. It's going to be the beginning of the death of the dollar. We're doing an economic market update. What's going on with the real estate? Oh, by the way, see the big news today? Housing prices are up. Yep. Housing prices are up. We said they weren't going to go down. You go back to Reuters, August 30th, it's in your Trends Journal, 2022, they quoted people saying how there's going to be a real estate market crash in the housing market. We said, absolutely no way. They don't give what we say. They only repeat the bullshit because they're prostitutes. So now housing prices have gone up, even though home sales are down to a 10-year low. We said this was going to happen. This is very different than the panic of 08 and the subprime mortgage crisis. Excuse me, it's a whole new game. What else do we have here? Yeah, home sales slow since 2010. What's next? When the economy falls, jobs go with it. Going out of business trends. Eurozone falling into recession. What does it mean? Oh, by the way, the street is saying that the Fed is going to begin to lower interest rates in May. You know what? No, they're not. They're going to be lowering them a lot quicker. That's right. And the more they lower them, the quicker they lower them, the deeper the dollar goes and the higher gold prices go.
In a shocking revelation, the head of President Vladimir Zelensky's parliamentary faction, David Arakhamia, said that Russia was ready to stop the fighting had Ukraine agreed to remain neutral, but the West advised Kiev to keep going. That kind of makes sense to me, doesn't it you? That a fragile peace could have been achieved, albeit one in which Ukraine would have agreed not to join NATO, but the West, for reasons of their or our own, decided to push Ukraine into war. Don't you get the idea when you see Zelensky cropping up on the Golden Globes or taking Sean Penn's Oscar? This is very much a person who's being exploited by Western interests that might be difficult to understand if you're involved in a regionalized conflict with a much more powerful nation with a deep, complex, ethno-national divide and formerly having been encompassed within the Soviet Union. Why, when Ukraine were on the brink of signing a deal, this is someone who was at the peace negotiations, leading the peace negotiations, why suddenly was that process disrupted? Who benefited from that? It certainly wasn't you. Arakhamia said that a shift toward neutrality would require a constitutional change, considering Ukraine's current constitutional commitment to NATO membership. And I'm sure that's a real bureaucratic headache to alter a nation's constitution, but it's not that great to have all of your fighting age males murdered to end up with an army full of the elderly fighting a war that can never be won. Arakhamia told Natalia Mosichuk, a Ukrainian journalist, that Russia saw Ukraine's neutrality as a key condition for a potential peace agreement. They really hoped almost to the last that they would put a squeeze on us to sign such an agreement so that we would take neutrality. It was the biggest thing for them, he said. In a way, you can sort of see the perspective of a former world power like Russia, or as it was formerly known, the Soviet Union, yielding power in former territories like Ukraine on the basis of neutrality. You can't imagine that the United States, as is often argued, would be happy to see Mexico or Canada forming alliances with Russia or China and joining trade agreements or military organizations with affiliations to. I mean, look how ferociously the United States will defend the dollar as their global currency. It's not something they're just going to give up easily. Look at the involvement in various global conflicts right now. World diplomacy is a pretty complex thing to contemplate, and I suppose if there was a fragile and nascent peace offering available, it should have been pursued and investigated. The idea that the West somehow disrupted it is worthy of inquiry. Where's the investigative journalism into subjects like this? Why are people not investigating? What the hell went on with Boris Johnson going over there? Why would that be? Is there any connection to the sort of subsequent deals with BlackRock for rebuilding Ukraine after the war? What is the intention of the United States? Why does Ukraine have these curious relationships with significant political figures like Joe Biden? What are these biolabs across the Ukraine? Why is Ukraine being set up as a kind of European battleship to agitate Russia? You notice how America likes to set up military bases around all of its enemies and infringe on all of its enemies and seems to somehow benefit from a state of constant global crisis. Well, is that why those peace deals were scuppered? Is it in any way beneficial to ordinary American people, ordinary Ukrainian people, ordinary Russian people to sustain this conflict? Let me know in the chat what you think. Former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson's unexpected visit to Kiev on April the 9th, 2022 had an impact on the potential ceasefire. Johnson advised against signing any agreement with Russia and encouraged Ukraine to continue the fight. What on earth did Boris Johnson say to agitate these people into an unwinnable war?
Homer, I seen prize fighters couldn't take a punch half as good as you. You know, boxing might be right up your alley.
Arakhamia recalled Johnson's stance, saying Ukraine shouldn't sign anything with them at all, and let's just fight. It's all very encouraging to hear Boris Johnson say stuff like that, but ultimately a significant price has been paid by the American taxpayer and by Ukrainian people more broadly. Are they any closer to achieving those goals? Is the situation any brighter after this counter-offensive that we were all meant to be so excited about? After learning that indeed it was Ukrainian special forces trained by the US that blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, do we feel any closer to a successful conclusion conclusion? Can we trust our leadership at all? Can we trust the legacy media and their reporting on it? Do you notice that much like with the pandemic period, there are sort of murmurings, hey, there was a peace deal on the table, and it's just sort of vague and unconfirmed. About a year later, yeah, there was a peace deal on the table. Same with the pipeline. Oh, that pipe, yeah, Russia did that. Won't have been Russia, will it? And then a couple of years later, yeah, sure enough, it was US Special Forces and Ukrainian Special Forces. So using that same device, what's going to happen here? Is this war just going to be prolonged, draining the American taxpayer, causing more poverty across America, draining the middle class, killing Ukrainian people, till eventually some sort of terrible, uneasy peace is achieved that somehow benefits energy interests and military industrial interests, and everyone just feels a bit drained and exhausted, and all the promises are lost in the mist of time and the fog of war? Probably. In a sense, war futile. When peace deals are offered, take them, particularly if it's against a global nuclear superpower, and always be circumspect about the way that legacy media gives you information, not only actually in matters of international conflict, but any matter at all. They'll initially present you with a crisis, they'll present you with a solution, they'll prevent you from analysing it, they'll keep you in highly emotional states like fear or rage. In the end, the solutions will have to be diplomatic, or the alternative, ongoing war, which is beneficial to certain interests, but requires the continual sacrifice of human life. 2 years ago, a choice could have been made. Don't have Ukraine join NATO, it's going to annoy Russia. All the stuff that was talked about in independent media spaces 2 or 3 years ago is now coming out into the legacy media. Why? Not by mistake, but because they're ready to reveal that information now, because they've got another war to be pursuing. They've got another way to funnel your tax dollars into the military-industrial complex. I'm sure that that's a simplification and a reduction of the complexity of those matters, particularly certain aspects of it that are ideological. But as a paradigm, as a template, it certainly makes sense to me.
You run your mouth and I run my business, brother. You tell everybody I'm busted. You talk so much you got me disgusted. But you run your mouth and I run my business, brother.
Everyone has that hack question, what made you a libertarian? There's a bunch of different things, but let me tell you, George Reisman's essays on gun control, healthcare, and a couple other topics instantly changed my mind. Like instantly. Where I would have thought, hey, we need reasonable gun control. And I read his article about on the government having guns to keep the government in check. And I was like, that makes perfect sense. Where I would have thought, of course, government should pay for healthcare. And then I read his article about eating in a restaurant. And if you're going to split the bill, you're going to order the most expensive thing, because you're not going to sit there and just let someone else order the most expensive thing. And talking about how government reforms in terms of incentives and unions and otherwise and tax benefits created the insurance phenomenon, which makes healthcare more expensive. On the spot, read that article, changed my mind. And I remember, and I just can't find it. Maybe if you're an internet sleuth, you can find it. I remember in college once writing some essay, coming across some concept of him of like American imperialism and dollar diplomacy. And then it was all about getting people to use the dollar so that we could, keep taking on more and more debt. And I can't re-find that article, but I remember it was one of the rare times in college you write something, you're like, holy shit, that just blew my mind. That is fascinating. So every once in a while, I check his blog about once a month. Because he only posts about once a month, and I'll read whatever he puts out there. It's usually great. And I'm not even saying that this is bad. I just thought that it was interesting because if I were to summarize the two approaches to the outlook of what's going on in Israel, on the Dave Smith, Scott Horton side, you've got Israel is engaging in killing innocent civilians, and they've stolen land, and they've empowered Hamas, and so. While no one's endorsing terrorist activities, on the same note, Israel doesn't have a right to go and kill civilians. And what they've done is atrocious, and they should start taking paths towards actually trying for a two-state solution and no longer keeping the Palestinians in a, I guess what they're calling an open-air prison. But, just to give a fair shake, to the other side, that sees this more as a, hey, this is a war, and this is what happens in war. I'm going to read this piece. I'm not going to argue with the piece. We're just going to read it as is, because in terms of arguing the side of, hey, this is a war, I feel like this is the probably cleanest way that I've seen it written up. And so let's give it a read. Will Biden's humanitarian aid to Gaza cost Israel the war? Biden, Blinken, Bugs Bunny, and other cartoon characters running our government either don't know what the word war means, which is possible since they don't seem to know what man and woman mean, or they want Hamas to win the war it has started with Israel. Imagine that Biden had been president in World War II. Would he have sent humanitarian aid to Germany and Japan to be sure that innocent civilians had food and medical supplies? Would he have believed that those supplies would actually get to any innocent civilians and not be appropriated by the Axis government to aid their continuing war effort? In World War II, we bombed the hell out of Germany and Japan day after day, night after night. Our goal was to destroy their war-making ability and not to worry about the effect on their civilians, most of whom supported their governments, just as most Gazans today support Hamas. Wouldn't it have been wonderful if the United States and Britain had controlled the water and electricity supplies in Germany and Japan like Israel controls them in Gaza? We could have shut off those supplies and just waited for the thirst and paralysis to compel the Axis to surrender. We could have demanded Hitler's and Tojo's heads, and before long, they probably would have been delivered on a pike. Not only would it not have been necessary to drop atomic bombs on Japan to end the war, but all the lives subsequently lost in combat and conventional bombing on both sides would have been spared. Giving humanitarian aid to Gaza and strong-arming Israelis not to cut off water and electricity to Gaza forces Israel into a war in which it must suffer large casualties, because then it can only root out the Hamas terrorists by going door to door, building by building, subject to booby traps and sniper fire at each step of the way. No, Israel must be free not only to shut off the water and electricity going to Gaza, but also to prevent supplies of any kind from entering Gaza and demand not only surrender by Hamas, but unconditional surrender. Only that will make it possible to secure Israel's military occupation of Gaza with minimal casualties, and then subsequent roundup and execution of the Hamas terrorists as promised by Minister Netanyahu in his speech following the Hamas attack, referred to Hamas members as dead men. If Biden policy of aid to the Hamas enemies continued, Israel may be forced to call off its invasion of Gaza to avoid the loss of a good portion of its army. In that case, Hamas will have won the war it started, and Israel will be subject to further horrific attacks by Hamas and every other gang of terrorists that may care to make one. This is a different article, which we'll read in a second. Anyways, want to put that out there. George Reisman really taking the other side on that aggressively, which I found shocking, because I've seen so many of the libertarians that I seem to read have taken more of the approach of looking at the, I guess, broader history that got into the situation than the more, I guess, what would appear to be a more limited perspective of, hey, these two people are at war and civilian casualties are a faculty of war, which, as I mentioned on the show before, I have wondered if there is a little bit of a like magnifying glass bias of that, you know, there's atrocities going on all over the world all the time, and we seem to be more zoomed in on this one. If you guys have followed the show thus far, we've argued the other way every single time. And so I'm throwing this out there as, look, here's the best version of the other argument that I've seen. Not endorsing it, just in case that wasn't clear.
Kick this off here, and I've got a bunch from James Wilson today. Here from his 4th of July oration in 1788, he said, "Where tyranny reigns, there is the country of ignorance and vice." We have others from people like Samuel Adams who said, "It is in the interests of tyrants to reduce the people to ignorance and vice." So the less that the people know, and the more that the government can control the education system, then the less the people know actually about how to control the government. This is really in their interest. And let's look at this article we just published by Mike Harry yesterday, which is adapted from his great book, Constitution Owner's Manual, that you should pick up over at shop.10thamendmentcenter.com. But here's how he put it. "I've been told that law students prepping for the bar exam are told that if the 10th Amendment is ever among the answers on a multiple choice question, they can immediately rule it out." I've heard this from many people, including Kevin Gutzman, who's been a longtime friend of the TAC. I've learned so much from him as well, that if you're studying for this, the 10th Amendment is always the wrong answer. And Mike continues, "For the experts and politicians," and he used experts in scare quotes here because, well, that's what they call themselves, "the 10th Amendment is never the right answer. And people with power absolutely love it that way." Now, Thomas Jefferson had a little bit of a different take on the impact and the importance of the 10th Amendment. For him, the 10th Amendment was always the right answer. And he put it this way in his opinion against the constitutionality of a national bank. This is February 15th, 1791, just 10 months to the day before ratification of the 10th and the entire Bill of Rights. Jefferson said, "I consider the foundation of the Constitution as laid on this ground, that all powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution or prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states or to the people." So Thomas Jefferson's view is that the entire structure of the Constitution is based on this understanding. And mind you, this was before the 10th Amendment was ratified. He knew it was being considered. But with James Wilson, who I'm going to cite as well here, he was taking the same position without that exact same text, the same position before they were even considering a 10th Amendment, a Bill of Rights at all. And he was actually arguing against a Bill of Rights, and maybe that'll make for an interesting episode one of these days. The Federalists were arguing against a Bill of Rights because they're saying, well, that makes it superfluous because the system is already set up in a way that if it's not delegated to the government, they don't have that power. But that's another discussion. Jefferson continues. He said, "To take a single step beyond the boundaries thus specially drawn around the powers of Congress is to take possession of a boundless field of power, no longer susceptible of any definition." And here from an overview page that we really should update and kind of improve. We got a lot of improvements to do on the website, so I appreciate any consideration you can give to joining us as a member, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I'll mention that again at the end of the show here. But here we write, "In legal terms, the 10th Amendment is what is known as a rule of construction. It doesn't actually add or remove anything from the document. It just explains the 9th Amendment is also a rule of construction. They actually go hand in hand. A lot of people think that they're totally separate, but they really are really a 1-2 punch. The 9th is really our best friend here at the 10th. but a rule of construction just tells you how to read the entire document. And that's, I should just read this to you instead of just blabbing. It doesn't add anything to the Constitution, nor does it take anything away, but it serves a very important function. It tells us how to interpret the document. Think of it like a lens through which we evaluate everything the federal government does. So if the 10th Amendment to Jefferson is the foundation of the Constitution, it's because he's understanding that the first thing you need to do when you look at have a question about the constitutionality of anything done anytime is you first have to look to see, has this been delegated to the government? And if not, it's reserved, period, straight up. You don't even have to get to questions of other amendments, etc. If it's not been delegated, they just can't do it. If you want it done by a government, I generally do not. I mean, that's being kind of soft on my real hardcore view. I do not want government to do stuff, but if government is going to do stuff, in most cases, it's better to have it closer home to the individual. Because if our ultimate goal is to advance individual liberty, our goal is to advance freedom. We're not thinking about collectivism. The closer that a decision is made to the individual, the more likely you'll have a chance of actually advancing liberty. Side note. Anyways, the 10th Amendment makes explicit two fundamental constitutional principles that are implicit in the document itself. One, the federal government is only authorized to exercise those powers delegated to it. Two, the people of the several states retain the authority to exercise any power that is not delegated to the federal government, as long as the Constitution doesn't expressly prohibit it. I think we should actually highlight whether we change the way that maybe we combine 1 and 2, but really we also have to point out that it affirms the fact, just like what John Jay was saying. John Jay said the Constitution only serves to point out that part of the people's business that they have decided to delegate to the government. This really affirms sovereignty. Final authority is with the people of the several states. And I think we really need to update that here as I'm talking about it, because that is really probably the most important thing. And, well, we got to do a better job on everything. Anyways, here's James Madison in his report of 1800, describing things of what they did in the Virginia resolutions of 1798 to John Adams's Alien and Sedition Acts. He said, the Constitution of the United States was formed by the sanction of the states, given by each in its sovereign capacity. Now, later, I think it's later in the report of 1800, may have been earlier, Madison clearly goes through the fact that states as a term can be used in many ways. I think he gave 5 different ways. Like it can be a geographic area. Some people may think it's the government of the state. But really, he said, when you're talking about ratification, the parties to the compact, to the Constitution, you're talking about the people of the several states, the people of each state in their highest sovereign capacity. Those are the parties to the Constitution to James Madison. So that's how he's using that term here. He's not talking about the sanction of the state governments, but the people composing those political societies. He said the states then being the parties to the constitutional compact, and in their sovereign capacity, it follows of necessity that there can be no tribunal above their authority to decide in the last resort whether the compact made by them be violated. And consequently, that as the parties to it, they must themselves decide in the last resort such questions as may be of sufficient magnitude to require their interposition.
It's much easier, Daniel, I think, for us to argue the moral case of why should we steal money from the poor people in this country, give them inflation, lower their standard of living, at the same time we send it off to somebody else that creates war. It perpetuates our problems. And some might say, Daniel, and I know you understand this, they say, yes, but we create jobs. The military-industrial complex, they're doing well. Their stock is up, and the people are working, and their wages are up. So this is all wonderful. And you know, there's so much strong evidence that's blatantly that, because now they admit the money never goes over into some other country's pocket. It goes directly over to the lobbyists and to the companies. We'll build these airplanes, and then we'll help you find a market, and we'll sell them for you. So we need an awakening, I'll tell you, just an awakening of some common sense in what really is going on. And that's why I think it's reasonable to suggest that the conditions right now are so frustrating, and that things that took a lot longer in '68 to get really bad, where the American people said enough is enough. I think right now the people are starting to say that, and we have not yet suffered anything like we were suffering in the '60s. So I, of course, encourage people to seek the truth and seek peace. And I know our institute here have a few suggestions on how we could achieve that.
You know, we both noticed this article in Politico. It's called "Activists Wanted a Middle East Ceasefire. They Got Something Else" from Democrats. And it's all about basically the civil war within the Democratic Party over President Biden's response to the Israeli invasion of Gaza after the terror attacks of October 7th on the part of Hamas. And it kind of goes along with this article that we also read in Moon of Alabama about the trajectory of President Biden's reactions to the October 7th attacks. and they were originally very hawkish. That's his political orientation. He's always been very hawkish, very neocon foreign policy, especially in the Middle East. But his initial reaction, of course, was to be in favor of basically ethnic cleansing. He's talking about they needed to have safe passage for Palestinians to leave the Gaza and all of this sort of thing. And then that transferred over when the pressure got up within his own party about this. And he didn't see it coming. He didn't see this huge backlash in his own party to his extremely one-sided, extremely pro-Israel reaction to it. And that's what we're seeing now, and it's cascading now down into the House and Senate, where Democrats are feeling the heat increasingly over the Middle East policy of President Biden. Yes,
you know, they had a resolution there that said you have to vote for this because we're sick and tired of, you know, anything said negatively about Israel. But it's not quite so simple. But they did that, and most of the resolution was decent until they said that criticizing the government of Israel is anti-Semitism, and that anything that talks about the philosophy of it, the Zionism and the stuff goes on. If you say anything that you're an anti-Semite, you're not allowed to think and and talk about it. So there was a vote, and you'll say, well, why even tell them about the vote? It was one-sided. You know, the whole thing was 400-something to 1. So that settled it, didn't it? No, I don't think so. I don't think it settled anything. So Thomas Massie voted against it. He says he can't understand why he has to vote something like this that says that he has a political opinion about foreign policy. Oh, you're an anti-Semite. And you know what? It didn't work. It hasn't worked for him. And I have a suspicion on why that happened. Yeah, they'll write things about it. But you know what? This is recalled. I think, Daniel, you were around and remember about it. I voted probably by myself, but had a vote to recognize Cardinal O'Connor. And I had nothing against him. I thought he was a great person, a great leader, and this sort of thing. And I would say praise him if you want to do that. But there was a gold medal involved. And well, you know, technically, you know, it sounds good. How could anybody be against that? I mean, to give the recognition to somebody like that. So I voted against it. And I remember very clearly, and this is what you might remember, Daniel, I came back to the office, and it was different than most of the time. I walked in, and the staff said, the New York Times called you, the New York Times called you. And I said, well, are they on the phone or something? I said, no, it looks like we took care of it. I said, well, what they call about? And they called about and said, why did Paul vote against a resolution to praise Cardinal O'Connor? And they said, oh, he votes always against anything like that, these gold medals, because technically it's not authorized in the Constitution. And the message they gave me said, oh, they were discussing, oh, heck. And I got off the phone. They said, oh, if that's the case, no story whatsoever. Yeah. The story could have been, why would somebody make that point? So, but people then generally left me alone and didn't pester me until they had an opportunity. But that's the big thing. I think the use of terms are terrible. They use it in a terrible way because back when I was campaigning for the presidency, anything to suggest that you're favorable toward the terrorists, I mean, that you lose your citizenship over that. But what if they distort it? And even today, I mean, they use the word terrorist carelessly and frequently, no matter what you do. You know, well, even like voting against some of that money to go to the middle of the wind. You mean you're going to let the terrorists win? And they use it constantly, but now they're using this and extremely distorting the view of anti-Semitism and people who are defending liberty and want everybody treated equally and making sure that we live up to the Constitution. All of a sudden they want to paint them as very bad people.
The whole argument of my book, Economics in One Lesson, may be summed up in the statement that in studying the effects of any given economic proposal, we must trace not merely the immediate results, but the results in the long run. Not merely the primary consequences, but the secondary consequences. And not merely the effects on some special group, but the effects on everyone. It follows that it is foolish and misleading to concentrate our attention merely on some special point. To examine, for example, merely what happens in one industry without considering what happens in all. But it is precisely from the persistent and lazy habit of thinking only of some particular industry or process in isolation that the major fallacies of economics stem. These fallacies pervade not merely the arguments of the hired spokesmen of special interests, but the arguments even of some economists who pass as profound. It is on the fallacy of isolation at bottom that the production for use and not for profit school is based, with its attack on the allegedly vicious price system. The problem of production say the adherents of this school is solved. Now, this resounding error, as we shall later see, is also the starting point of most currency cranks and share the wealth charlatans. The problem of production is solved. The scientists, the efficiency experts, the engineers, the technicians have solved it. They could turn out almost anything you cared to mention in huge and practically unlimited amounts. But alas, the world is not ruled by the engineers, thinking only of production, but by the businessmen, thinking only of profit. The businessmen give their orders to the engineers, instead of vice versa. These businessmen will turn out any object as long as there is a profit in doing so. But the moment there is no longer a profit in making that article, the wicked businessmen will stop making it. So many people's wants are unsatisfied, and the world is crying for more goods. There are so many fallacies in this view that they cannot all be disentangled at once. But the central error, as we have hinted, comes from looking at only one industry, or even at several industries in turn, as if each of them existed in isolation. Each of them in fact exists in relation to all the others, and every important decision made in it is affected by and affects the decisions made in all the others. We can understand this better if we understand the basic problem that business collectively has to solve. To simplify this as much as possible, let us consider the problem that confronts a Robinson Crusoe on his desert island. His wants at first seem endless. He is soaked with rain. He shivers from cold. He suffers from hunger and thirst. He needs everything: drinking water, food, a roof over his head, protection from animals, a fire, a soft place to lie down. It is impossible for him to satisfy all these needs at once. He has not the time, energy, or resources. He must attend immediately to the most pressing need. He suffers most, say, from thirst. He hollows out a place in the sand to collect rainwater, or builds some crude receptacle. When he has provided for only a small water supply, however, he must turn to finding food before he tries to improve this. He can try to fish, but to do this he needs either a hook and line or a net, and he must set to work on these. But everything he does delays or prevents him from doing something else, only a little less urgent. He is faced constantly by the problem of alternative applications of his time and labor. A Swiss Family Robinson, perhaps, finds this problem a little easier to solve. It has more mouths to feed, but it also has more hands to work for them. It can practice division and specialization of labor. The father hunts. The mother prepares the food. The children collect firewood. But even the family cannot afford to have one member of it doing endlessly the same thing, regardless of the relative urgency of the common need he supplies and the urgency of other needs still unfilled. When the children have gathered a certain pile of firewood, they cannot be used simply to increase the pile. It is soon time for one of them to be sent, say, for more water. The family, too, has the constant problem of choosing among alternative applications of labor. And if it is lucky enough to have acquired guns, fishing tackle, a boat, axes, saws, and so on, of choosing among alternative applications of labor and capital. It would be considered unspeakably silly for the wood-gathering member of the family to complain that they could gather more firewood if his brother helped him all day, instead of getting the fish that were needed for the family dinner. It is recognized clearly in the case of an isolated individual or family that one occupation can expand only at the expense of all other occupations. Elementary illustrations like this are sometimes ridiculed as Crusoe economics. Unfortunately, they are ridiculed most by those who most need them, who fail to understand the particular principle illustrated, even in this simple form, or who lose track of that principle completely when they come to examine the bewildering complications of a great modern economic society. Let us now turn to such a society.
So senior U.S. officials speaking to Politico on Wednesday have reaffirmed that the Biden administration intends to place no conditions on future military aid to Israel, despite public comments suggesting the idea was under consideration. So amid growing calls from Democrats to condition military aid to Israel, President Biden told reporters recently that the idea is a worthwhile thought, but U.S. officials are saying it will not happen, saying that it is not something the U.S. is currently pursuing. And these comments from Biden that it's something worth thinking about must have set off some alarm bells in Israel and among hawks in the U.S., because you have all these officials now, saying, no, don't worry about it. It's still unconditional, which is really something if you think about it. There's absolutely no conditions on these weapons that we're sending to Israel. No matter what they do, we're going to keep doing it. Doesn't matter. And these comments come, the comments walking back what Biden said, they come as we're seeing all these reports that say the U.S. is trying to pressure Israel on its campaign in the south. Once the hostage deal truce resumes, they're expected to expand military operations in southern Gaza, where there's hundreds of thousands of displaced Palestinians who fled the north. So Gaza in the south is even more densely populated than normal. So the civilian casualties are expected to be even worse than what we saw in the past, month and a half, almost 2 months now. So anyway, we're seeing all these reports saying, and also public comments from Biden officials saying that we're not going to support their campaign in the south if they don't take account for the civilians that are there. But at the same time, it's unconditional, so it doesn't really matter. So you are going to support it, whether you say you are or not, because you're funding this military. So The Economist reported on Tuesday that internal polling in Ukraine shows that Zelensky could lose a presidential election if he faces off with General Valery Zaluzhny, who's the Ukrainian commander-in-chief. So far, Zaluzhny has not expressed an interest in entering into politics, but he's been rumored to be a potential candidate for a long time. I feel like for the past year, I've seen these kind of rumors that Zaluzhny is a potential opponent of Zelensky if there ever is a election. And it's also been reported that Zaluzhny and Zelensky have been at odds with each other, and this spat spilled out into the public recently after Zaluzhny was very candid about the situation on the battlefield. He called the war against Russia a stalemate, said there would likely be no deep and beautiful breakthrough. So there's a quote here from Zelensky that I actually missed, and he took a pretty, a swipe at Zaluzhny and other generals for saying things like that, and it's strange. So Zelensky said, quote, "If a military man decided to do politics, it is his right. Then he should enter politics, and then he can't deal with war," end quote. So basically saying, shut up, Zaluzhny. And he's not really talking politics. He's talking about the situation on the battlefield. He is Ukraine's top general. So I'm sure that did not sit right with Zaluzhny. And polling shows that Ukrainian public trust is much higher when it comes to Zaluzhny. They trust Zaluzhny much more than Zelensky, according to these polls that were viewed by The Economist. And the report reads that the figures, which date from mid-November, show that trust in the president has fallen to a net plus 32%. So these are a net percentage. So that doesn't mean that it's only 32%. I forget exactly how it's worked out, but it's like they subtract the people who don't trust Zelensky from the people who do, the percentage of people who do, and they get that number 32%. But Zaluzhny is plus 32%. Zaluzhny is plus 70%. So that's more than double what Zelensky is. And Ukraine's spy chief, Kirilo Budanov, who's responsible for a lot of the assassinations that we're seeing, he also has a better rating than the president at plus 45%. So Ukraine's next presidential election is scheduled for March 2024, but Zelensky has ruled out holding one during the war because Ukraine's constitution prohibits holding a vote under martial law. So that's the excuse that Zelensky is using. So this is some good news. This was reported by Responsible Statecraft on Wednesday, and it says that Senator Rand Paul is planning to force a vote on a resolution that he introduced to withdraw all U.S. troops from Syria, as U.S. bases in the country have come under frequent attack since mid-October. Paul introduced the resolution on November 15th, and it would order the removal of the approximately 900 U.S. troops that are stationed in Syria within 30 days unless President Biden receives authorization for war from Congress. Sources told Responsible Statecraft that the vote could happen as early as next week. Earlier this year, Matt Gaetz, over in the House, he's a Republican from Florida, he introduced a similar resolution which failed pretty badly in a vote of 103 to 321. According to the Pentagon, there has been at least 73 attacks on U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria, including over 30 in Syria, so it's roughly half and half. So this is a good time, I think, for Rand Paul to force a vote on this when you have U.S. troops coming under constant attack. I wish more of these guys that, like Gaetz, people who have been good on this before, were more outspoken about the risk of the U.S. getting dragged into a war in the Middle East. But unfortunately, a lot of them are all about supporting and funding Israel, and all that stuff goes out the window when it comes to Israel, the whole ending wars thing.
Here's Gerald Celente with today's trends in the news.
The one I'm writing about here, this will scandalize people to know that this is a law, suspends the Fourth Amendment protections for a class of persons. Now, the Fourth Amendment doesn't protect just Americans. It protects persons, good persons, bad persons, Americans, non-Americans, people the government likes, those that do what the government tells them to do, and people the government hates, those that resist and challenge the government. But the Congress has suspended the Fourth Amendment for foreign persons communicating from outside the United States into the United States, foreign people in the U.S. communicating to foreigners outside, foreign people inside the U.S. communicating to each other, and foreign people communicating to Americans. So if you're an American talking to a foreign person, for the purpose of that communication, your Fourth Amendment rights have been suspended. What does that mean? It means the government can engage in surveillance without suspicion, without probable cause, without a search warrant. That's the law. That law, known as Section 702 of the FISA Act, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, expires on December 31st of this year, a month from now, and it is up for renewal. And Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, when he was Congressman Johnson, voted against its extension 5 years ago, spoke against its extension 5 years ago, and said, as Congressman Johnson, there should be an up or down vote on this because the majority of the House is against it. But as Speaker Johnson, he's in favor of extending it and will not permit an up or down vote. They're going to take this and bury it in the NDAA. What's the NDAA? The National Defense Authorization Act, basically the appropriations for the Defense Department. So nobody is going to vote against funding the Defense Department in order to oppose this thing, and we'll never know who opposed it because they buried it in the middle of this 1,000-page piece of legislation. That's the government today. That's the Republican leadership in the House of Representatives today, trashing the Constitution.
Well, they're all trashing it. It's one after another. They're all, again, you mentioned that this happened under Bush administration and Dick Cheney, with this whole 9/11 baloney. And again, look at the great success they've had since 9/11 in all their spying. Look at the great accomplishments they've achieved. How about absolutely nothing? Yet it costs us trillions of dollars and robs us of our freedom.
For a while, the FBI was engaged in these setups where they find some sort of a disaffected Muslim young man and they approach him in some facility and they ingratiate themselves with him and they say, hey, I can sell you powder to blow up a subway. And he goes to press the button.
I remember that.
It's really flour. And then they say, look how we saved you and all of our surveillance saved you. They made the whole thing up.
Yep.
We haven't seen too much of that lately because the FBI has gotten more sophisticated. So not only do they take advantage of the Fourth Amendment being suspended for foreigners, they may very well induce a phone call to you or me or any unsuspecting American as to whom there's no probable cause of crime from a foreign person. And that communication legally can be surveilled. And it doesn't end there. They will go to foreign social media digital companies, even those located in the US, Facebook, and buy data of foreign persons and mine the data to see if they've communicated with Americans. There is no end to what the government will go through to insinuate itself into our private lives. Thank you, Mike Johnson.
And again, it's you right here. Question: can Congress modify a constitutional requirement? Answer: no. If it could, the Constitution would no longer be the supreme law of the land, but rather a facade subject to prevailing political winds. And that's exactly what it's become. I mean, you're talking here about, the Fourth Amendment. How about the First Amendment? We could start from the number one and go all the way through. Freedom of speech. I mean, they've robbed us of everything. This is very sad what's going on. And if the people don't unite against this, and unfortunately, there's nobody running for president that I see that could change any of this. They were going to overthrow the government. There were 39 weeks of major protests. Totally forgotten. Totally forgotten. So I believe Netanyahu knew it. And he wanted it to happen. They do it all the time. Again, we've both talked about what happened following the Great Depression, World War II. What followed the dot-com bust? The War on Terror. So that's the way I see it.
Well, Netanyahu likes to compare himself to FDR. FDR surely knew that Pearl Harbor was going to happen, and he allowed 2,700 young sailors to be sitting ducks and murdered on December 7th, 1941. So it would flip American public opinion. It flipped it almost exactly. It was 80% against entering World War II on December 7th. On December 9th, it was 80% in favor of entering World War II. So he succeeded.
Yep.
One of the greatest acts of mass murder in history. And did George W. know about 9/11? Well, the Israelis knew about 9/11. They were celebrating in Jersey City across the Hudson River, filming the destruction of the World Trade Towers as it was happening. Who were they? Mossad.
Yep, that's it. And people believe what they're being fed. So, Judge, thank you for being on, and everybody, please do what you can to support peace, because
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
And so you would see these bizarre anomalies like that. Like, what would make you think? And so, in particular, if we look in some parts of Asia, you would see that it looked like no matter what you did, you got basically the same result, and sometimes you got a basically pretty good result. So you had South Korea with its massive testing, but then you had Japan with its very lackluster testing and their refusal to test people without symptoms, and they had a lackluster lockdown and all this other stuff, and they basically did fine. So it looks like the policy, as you said earlier, Nick, just doesn't correspond certainly with better results anywhere, and yet it seems like it should. On some level, it seems like this should have helped. It seems like it ought to have helped. And I say that as somebody who is dead set against lockdowns and all the rest of it. It seems like it should have done some good, and it is absolutely bizarre to me that it didn't.
Yeah, a more common objection that we receive, and one that maybe we should respond to, is, okay, so if you had this effect of standards of care changing, would it have been the same wouldn't it have been the same in other countries? But because everybody locked down, there were lots of lockdowns around and so on. But what we point to there is that some of these effects are quite subtle, so they depend on the degree to which there was a take-up of the policies. And the example we like to refer to is from a pre-COVID phenomenon. There's a phenomenon known as the weekend effect. If you're going to go to hospital, it's much better to go to hospital on Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday. On the weekend, there's generally lower levels of healthcare worker attendance. And that's associated with higher mortality, as in notably higher mortality. And that's for a hospital operating under normal conditions where they're supposedly trying to do the best for their patients and so on. There's no emergency conditions. So if you layer on an environment of fear and a sense of some kind of state of disaster, and you're terrifying the healthcare workers. I mean, I remember back in the early days in South Africa, there would be a tradition of banging pots and pans at the times of day when the healthcare workers were supposedly going into work or leaving work, with the idea being that they were marching into their deaths. Meanwhile, the reality was that for any vaguely healthy under 70-year-old, the mortality rate from COVID is negligible. So they weren't actually going into any kind of dangerous environment, but they were being consistently told that they were. And this must have changed their attitude towards their patients, the likelihood that they would spend time in the physical presence of the people who were ill, especially these frail elderly people. And we know very well from RCU statistical investigations that the presence of healthcare workers in the immediate environments of the patient is crucially important. If you take that away, things go wrong without being noticed, and people
there's
die.
plenty of testimony of people both in care homes and in hospitals of how people, they were told to minimize contact with patients. They were told to keep the door shut and only check on them every few hours. There's probably a huge number of people in different jurisdictions who pretty clear the relatives think that their elderly loved ones died of dehydration or neglect, and putting the term broadly. So it's a very complex picture. And just to expand on what Nick was saying, that there's a tendency to try to systematize the analysis of lockdown effects. So you've got your lockdown stringency index, for example, and that includes things like, well, did they shut what size grocery stores did they shut? Did they shut gyms? Did they shut schools and everything? But the fact is that those aren't where the deaths occurred, and those stringency indexes are largely useless for analytical purposes. What you actually have to get into is the weeds of what actually was done to vulnerable people, because New York aside, which is a bit of a weird case, across most of the world, it's pretty much accepted that the people who died were elderly and vulnerable health, and vulnerable health problems. So it's really what happened in care homes and in hospitals where they were receiving elderly people with respiratory illnesses, or out in the community, how elderly people were being treated with a respiratory illness. That's what determines outcome from whatever happened. So if you take, for example, Germany, Germany has huge overcapacity in its health system, so it was able to accommodate a disruption in a relatively kind of disciplined and non-hysterical way, in which the system didn't fall apart. Well, I can tell you that in the UK, that the National Health Service runs at very, very high capacity all the time, and it's always stretched. It's always on the edge of breaking down. It's pretty easy to see how, if you dramatically change the way people are told to work and react to patients with testing and isolation and separating patients off, it is not difficult to see how that would be a health disaster. As Nick said, We had a few years ago, one of the health minister in the UK, he had a campaign. One of his things he wanted to bring in was, I want a 7-day NHS, for exactly the reason that Nick gave, which is that patients at the weekend had a worse outcome. So you can imagine if that was detectable as a worse outcome, just as lowering of staffing levels at the weekend, well, you can imagine when people have to, the health workers having to isolate for 10 days because somebody in their child's school tested positive or whatever, they have to stay at home. It was, the times were completely insane.
The Peter Schiff Show.
That in my absence, the gold price managed to get above $2,000. And then in the last couple of days, rallied some more. In fact, gold was up about $25 today, and it's up again in the evening, up about another $8, $9. It's almost at $20 and $2,050 per ounce. So I believe their all-time record high was $2,080 per ounce. So we're almost there. But I think what's going to be substantial is once we get above that, I'd say maybe 2,100, just to kind of put a little cushion between the old record high and the price of gold. I think the price is going to move up dramatically in a short period of time. I mean, gold should already be much higher than where it is. I think it's kind of been a gift horse that the price has stayed so low. Although silver, talk about a gift horse, I think the silver price is a much greater deal. I mean, silver has to about double to hit its record high. Gold is only about 1% below its record high. But gold stocks have to go up about 50% just to get back to where they were at their peak in 2020. But if you're talking about when gold hit its record in 2011, which is pretty much about the same price it's at right now, maybe a little bit lower back then. The record might have been slightly lower than the current price. For gold stocks to get back to where they were in 2011, the GDX, which is the senior producers, that has to double from here. And the juniors, which, the GDXJ, which is an index of junior gold miners, has to almost increase fivefold. Those stocks are down almost 80% in the last 12, 13 years, even though the price of gold has stayed the same. Right? It's still right around the 2000 high that it hit in 2011. And a lot of that is because of the sentiment. There's just so much negative sentiment out there that this Fed inflation fight is going to somehow kill gold. The Fed is just going to be so tough and so resolute in bringing inflation back down to 2% that it's just going to hammer gold. And so nobody wants to buy these mining stocks. The reality is the Fed is not going to win the inflation fight. In fact, it's already lost. And I think that's going to be more apparent in the months ahead, particularly if we get a breakdown in the dollar, which is starting. The dollar index is now down at about 102.5. It continues to weaken. It was down again today. And I think we're getting very close to a breakdown in the dollar and then a crash in the dollar. And the breakdown in the dollar should, kind of correlate with the breakout in gold, because that's what people are doing when they're selling their dollars. They're buying gold. They're getting rid of a fiat currency and they're buying real money. And this is going to be a huge problem. It's a game changer for the Fed, because when the dollar really starts to tank, that's going to put a lot of upward pressure on consumer prices and interest rates, and ultimately unemployment. You're going to see unemployment going up, inflation going up, and interest rates going up all at the same time. I mean, talk about a misery index. It's going to hit record highs potentially by the 2024 election, which is why I've said it's going to be so difficult for Biden to be reelected in an economic environment that's going to be that drastic. So much more money has been printed. The fiscal predicament is so much graver now than it was back then when I was talking about $5,000 gold. Of course, when I was talking about $5,000 gold, it wasn't that far away. Gold was almost $2,000, so it didn't even have that far to go. But now my price target is substantially higher. So I think there's a lot more money that will be made in the mining stocks when gold finally breaks out and investors, the bears on these stocks, throw in the towel. I was watching on CNBC just yesterday, when they were commenting on the markets, and they talked about the stock market, they talked about the bond market, the oil market, Bitcoin, but no mention of gold at all. In fact, I didn't even hear them mention it today. Not like I watched nonstop, but I watch it occasionally, and they talk about it. I didn't hear anybody mention gold today. Now, maybe somebody did when I wasn't watching, but I wonder how high it's going to have to go before it grabs anybody's attention. Personally, I prefer a stealth bull market. The fewer people that hop on board, the better. Let the price move up a lot more before the mainstream investor starts to notice how much the price of gold has gone up and how much the mining stocks have gone up. I'd rather have them go up before the general public buys. But I want my audience to buy now. I don't want them to buy later and pay higher prices. I'd rather get them on board. And it also means that all of our strategies, if the dollar is going to tank the way I think it's going, then our foreign stocks are going to do very well because they're non-dollar. Plus, a lot of them have exposure to commodities. And I think in a weak dollar environment, which is where we're headed, those stocks are going to flourish.
The whole issue here is lying. And I think there's a famous quote, probably everybody in this audience has heard it maybe more than once, and I'm going to put it up because it tells you a lot about how people think about lying. And it's the Goring quote. I want to put that up, and I'm going to read that, and because this tells you, a person that was seen as the epitome of evil actually spouting something off. It was pretty well the honest truth as he faced death at Nuremberg. So I'm going to go ahead and read this because it's a whole lot of information here. He said, of course, and he was interviewed as he was a prisoner, and within days that he was convicted, and then he killed himself trying to avoid the killing by the government. He says, this is Goring, why, of course the people don't want war. Why should some poor slob on a farm want to risk his life in a war when the best he can get out of it is to come back to his farm in one piece? Naturally, the common people don't want war neither in Russia, nor in England, nor for that matter in Germany. That is understood. But after all, it is the leaders of the country who determine the policy, and it is always a simple matter to drag the people along, whether it's a democracy or a fascist dictatorship or a parliament or a communist dictatorship. Voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That's easy. All you have to do is tell them they are being attacked and denounce the peacemakers for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same in any country. Well, I'll tell you what, that is some quote considering where it's coming from. Somebody that was going to commit suicide or be killed within days and was being tried for what was going on, during the Hitler warmongering in World War II. But it's obvious that they live lies, and yet you get a mouthful of truth. And I see that in comparison to most of what we hear from our politicians, where they're not the total blatant lies. Sometimes it's just fibbing and demagoguing and politicking and everything. But they don't live with a bundle of truth like we have here.
Yet there's never any repercussions for, as you call them correctly, these big lies. It's only the little lies as to whether his Ferragamo shoes are 6 years old or 1 year old. Those are the ones they want to get him on, not the big lies of the others.
Yeah, but they always promise good things. If they're talking about foreign policy and the need to spend money and send kids off to war for peace, for prosperity, and always for democracy. We have to protect democracy. And democracy, but they never say, we ought to reconsider the fact of restoring the republic that we were given, which was clearly given to us. But no, does any school, teach the difference of that? Why should they? Because they're government schools. The schools are there, to teach people how to have this distortion of the truth. So it involves so many things. Right now, I think there's a lot of lies told about the climate, and nobody knows what to believe. And fortunately, people waking up, they're just getting sick and tired of it. They're catching on. The government lies to it, and yet they're very gullible. And like Goring says, you can't have patriotism. Use patriotism and lie to them, and they will always go along. We hear lies about what's going on our borders. They're involved in medicine. Think of all the lies told in the people who were punished over COVID. And that was you talk about a conspiracy of lies, and that was so bad. The combination of big corporations, the pharmaceuticals, along with governments, is still going on. Where the true fascism or corporatism exists, and then they can flip that around into people who are fighting all this. They're called, the fascists. So it's all based on how they can lie their way out of the system, but. They always say, when the other biggest lie that I've talked about for quite a few years is the lies about money. that they have convinced people that as long as the government gives us money, as long as they spend money, that we will have prosperity. And so where are we now by living with this? And that's been for 100 years. It's being questioned now, which is great because it doesn't work and people are getting poorer. But all they say is we have to have a flexible monetary system. We have to have a government management of it. You can't have the market determining this. And it's all based on a fraudulent arguments. I mean, we have the counterfeiters in charge, and hardly anybody stands up and say enough is enough. But more and more, and we're going to keep plugging away there. But I think, some of the big ones, certainly the oath of office is a real big one. The money issue is a real big one. The justification for forward policy, Daniel, I think is a horror. That's why I used that quote, just to show how those who were perpetuating it knew how to do it. And it was sort of a confession, I assume, but it's just an interesting statement by Goring.
How is the problem of alternative applications of labor and capital to meet thousands of different needs and wants of different urgencies solved in such a society? It is solved precisely through the price system. It is solved through the constantly changing interrelationships of cost of production, prices, and profits. Prices are fixed through the relationship of supply and demand, and in turn affect supply and demand. When people want more of an article, they offer more for it. The price goes up. This increases the profits of those who make the article. Because it is now more profitable to make that article than others, the people already in the business expand their production of it, and more people are attracted to the business. This increased supply then reduces the price and reduces the profit margin until the profit margin on that article once more falls to the general level of profits, relative risks considered, in other industries. Or the demand for that article may fall, or the supply of it may be increased to such a point that its price drops to a level where there is less profit in making it than in making other articles. Or perhaps there is an actual loss in making it. In this case, the marginal producers, that is, the producers who are least efficient or whose costs of production are highest, will be driven out of business altogether. The product will now be made only by the more efficient producers who operate at lower costs. The supply of that commodity will also drop, or will at least cease to expand. This process is the origin of the belief that prices are determined by costs of production. The doctrine stated in this form is not true. Prices are determined by supply and demand is determined by how intensely people want a commodity and what they have to offer in exchange for it. It is true that supply is in part determined by costs of production. What a commodity has cost to produce in the past cannot determine its value. That will depend on the present relationship of supply and demand. But the expectations of businessmen concerning what a commodity will cost to produce in the future and what its future price will determine how much of it will be made. This will affect future supply. There is therefore a constant tendency for the price of a commodity and its marginal cost of production to equal each other, but not because that marginal cost of production directly determines the price. The private enterprise system, then, might be compared to thousands of machines, each regulated by its own quasi-automatic governor. Yet with these machines and their governors all interconnected and influencing each other, so that they act in effect like one great machine.
So this article is from the New York Times, and this seems like a pretty huge story. This was published on Thursday night, not long before I planned on starting recording this. And I'm just going to read some of it for you. Israeli officials obtained Hamas's battle plan for the October 7th terrorist attack more than a year before it happened, documents, emails, and interviews show. But Israeli military and intelligence officials dismissed the plan as aspirational, considering it too difficult for Hamas to carry out. The approximately 40-page document, which the Israeli authorities codenamed Jericho Wall, outlined point by point exactly the kind of devastating invasion that led to the deaths of about 1,200 people. The documents circulated widely among Israeli military and intelligence leaders, but experts determined that an attack of that scale and ambition was beyond Hamas's capabilities, according to documents and officials. It is unclear whether Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu or other top political leaders saw the document as well. So again, this is really saying something here. I went over a few reports. There was one recently from Haaretz saying that Israeli women in the military who were watched basically security cameras all day of what's going on in Gaza, were issuing all these warnings that were being ignored. And they said that it's a plan designed to start a war, not just a raid on a village. Officials privately concede that had the military taken these warnings seriously and redirected significant reinforcements to the south where Hamas attacked, Israel could have blunted the attacks or possibly even prevented them. Instead, the Israeli military was unprepared as terrorists streamed out of the Gaza Strip. It was the deadliest day in Israel's history. Israeli security officials have already acknowledged that they failed to protect the country, and the government is expected to assemble a commission to study the events leading up to the attack. So this is related to that hostage deal that the U.S. and Iran made not too long ago. Sorry, it's not loading for some reason. Oh, there it goes. Okay, so the House on Thursday passed a bill that would force the president to permanently freeze $6 billion in Iranian funds that were briefly made available to Tehran as part of a prisoner swap deal. Under the deal, the U.S. and Iran exchanged prisoners, and the U.S. allowed the transfer of $6 billion from South Korea to Qatar, where Iran would receive access to the money. But shortly after the October 7th Hamas attack on southern Israel, the Biden administration decided to go back on the deal and cut off Iran's access to the money. The administration made the move due to claims and pressure from Congress over claims that Iran was involved in the October 7th attack, even though there's no indication that it was. U.S. intelligence, according to media reports, said that Iran was surprised by the Hamas assault. Israel has said it had no evidence of Iranian involvement. That didn't matter to the Republicans in Congress, who just made a huge deal about the $6 billion in Iran's own money that President Biden so graciously allowed them to access. It just goes to show how there's just no thinking among these people. They just want to use every opportunity, use every crisis to advance some sort of agenda. So the bill that was passed by the House on Thursday would make the administration's move to freeze the Iranian funds permanent by requiring sanctions on any foreign entity that moves to make them available for Iran. The legislation passed in a vote of 307 to 119, with 118 Democrats and one Republican, Representative Thomas Massie of Kentucky, opposing the bill. So Massie was the only Republican, and 118 Democrats were against it. And they explained their opposition was, the U.S. is saying, Iran could only access the funds for humanitarian spending. Biden did such a great job brokering this deal. That was their argument. But I really like what Massie said, because he explained his opposition in a post on X. And he said, quote, "There's no legal or moral authority for us to freeze or steal assets of other countries we are not at war with. It's also short-sighted for us to use our superpower status to force foreign banks to freeze assets of sovereign countries," end quote. So I really like that, because that's just, we don't have the right to sanction and freeze and steal and take money from other countries. We shouldn't do it. It's just kind of as simple as that, and it's a good principle stance on sanctions. So this article is from the South China Morning Post, and it says that China has confirmed the U.S. and China are working to restore these military communication channels that have been suspended. Many of them were suspended after Nancy Pelosi, when she was the House Speaker, made her very provocative trip to Taiwan last year. And when Biden and President Xi Jinping met recently, they agreed to restart military communication and dialogue. China's basically just confirming it here. This was China's defense ministry. And also they reiterated a willingness to cooperate on AI, but is warning against military activity near its shores and aid to Taiwan. So the two big things that China's really unhappy with when it comes to the military stuff, of course, is the U.S. giving military aid to Taiwan, which is unprecedented in this era that we're in. The U.S. has sold weapons to Taiwan, but never given them weapons free of charge or financed the purchase, as they have been doing now. I think kind of the big question when it comes to these military communications is if Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, is going to have a high-level meeting with a Chinese military official. Right now, their defense ministry position is vacated since they got rid of Li Shangfu, who was under U.S. sanctions, and because of that, and because the U.S. refused to lift the sanctions, China declined a meeting between Li and Austin. So
here's Gerald Celente with today's trends in the news.
World economy will slow next year because of inflation, high rates, and war. That's according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And there's no fucking Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's a fucking crime syndicate run by the bigs. They say the United States and China, they could decelerate. The U.S. economy is forecast to expand just 1.5% in 2024. So when you put 1.5% expansion and you put real inflation into it, it's declining. Okay? Those are the facts. Only, and China, China with their zero COVID policy. We're writing week after week after week after week after week where China's going and why. And again, we reversed our trends. We said that the 20th century was the American century, but the 21st century would be the Chinese century because the business of America has been war and the business of China is business. But when they launched the COVID war on Chinese Lunar New Year, 2020, the year of the rat, and 3 years of zero COVID policy, they destroyed the lives and livelihoods of hundreds of millions of people throughout China. So this thing isn't coming back. So they did it to themselves. Yep. Again, all your data is in your magazine. And again, then you have this war going on, the Israel war. Then you have the Ukraine war. And again, there's reports coming out that Ukraine is now sending missiles and bombs like 3,000 miles into Russia. I warned about this week after week after week. They lost the war. They're going to do a major event, false flag, real, bomb a nuclear plant, something, blame it on Russia, whatever. They're going to get back in the news, and they're going to keep pumping more money into keeping this war going. And this is going to have an effect on the economy. Pending home sales dropped to a record low, even worse than during the financial crisis. The CNBC, they hit the lowest level since the National Association of Realtors began tracking this metric in 2001. And the mortgage rates have come down. They're about 7.3%, but they're still too high. And this is interesting. They noted that home sales priced above $750,000 are increasing. Yep. So the people with dough keep buying. And again, the markets up where I am up here in Kingston, New York, are still very hot. Yep. Sales are down 8.5% from October of last year. The GAO estimated 17 agencies had used an average of only 1/4 or less of the capacity of the headquarters. We're paying this fucking money for these clowns. Look at this shit. 1/4 vacancy occupancy rate. 1/4. Federal agencies spend about $2 billion a year to operate federal office buildings and $5 billion annually to lease privately owned office spaces. $7 billion bucks robbing our fucking money because these scumbags are in charge. Quote, whether you're talking about downtown Boston or Denver or North Virginia, occupancy is down substantially. And this is according to John Fish, chairman of Real Estate Roundtable. No fucking shit. How long have we warned this? It goes back to what no one's talking about, the banking crisis that's going to come. It's going to happen. There's going to be defaults like you've never seen before. Again, here it is. It's global. Property slump hits Renee Benko. The property slump sweeping the globe has claimed the new high-profile victim, Renee Benko, an Austrian-born realtor of department store magnate. Benko's main holding company, Signal Holdings, said Wednesday it is filing for insolvency in Austria with its valued property portfolio of nearly $30 billion fucking dollars. U.S. suicides reached a record last year. No shit. We warned about this would happen when they locked down everybody. And this is the fucking language they use. This is why you get the Trends Journal. You go to trendsjournal.com, trendsjournal.com. Here's what they write. The record reflects a broad struggle to help people in mental distress following a pandemic. Now, not a pandemic. 99.93% of the people are still alive. All right? And when you look at the numbers that come out now that they're finally reporting that if you broke your neck and fell off a ladder and broke your neck, but you had COVID, they put you down as COVID rather than a busted neck. So the numbers are even lower. So it wasn't a pandemic, but going on, right? Little fuck faces made this shit up. Stand 6 feet apart. Put on your mask when you walk in a restaurant. Take it off when you sit down. When you walk in an airplane, put on that mask. Take it off when you're eating and drinking, even though people are sitting all around you, because COVID knows when you're eating and drinking. So just do what you're told. They fucked this thing up so bad. Again, going back to China, all things are connected when they launched the COVID war. And again, I believe they did that to stop the protests in Hong Kong. Out of 7.5 million people, over 1 million were taken to the streets. COVID came, can't go protest anymore, can't protest. And again, one of our top trends for 2020 was New World Disorder. There were protests going on everywhere. COVID came, they stopped, and there were protests in Algeria, in Lebanon, in South Africa, in India, in Algeria, all over the world. Colombia, Peru, Chile. Can't go out anymore. I wonder why people are committing suicide. Anyway, check out yesterday's Celente and the Judge.
Section 702 of the FISA Act, which expires this Christmas time, basically removes Fourth Amendment protections to foreign individuals communicating into, out of, or within the United States, and the Americans with whom they communicate. How Congress thinks it can suspend the Fourth Amendment for a class of people is beyond me. We'll talk about the theory for a minute. But the practice, what's happening here, how the Republicans, many of your colleagues, many of our friends, have betrayed the Constitution is what I want to discuss. Where does it stand as we speak? The efforts by Republican leadership to reenact, to prevent from expiring this monstrous law.
Judge, first of all, thanks for having me. It's good to be with you. And thanks for your leadership on this issue, because you're an important voice and you need to keep out there vocalizing the pernicious 702. I mean, let's talk about where it stands. That's what you want to know where it stands. So procedurally, we have a bill that we've been putting together that has what I would call the reforms that even the Intel community, the Intel committee agrees we should have. So that's a kind of our base bill that we're working from. And next week, the House Judiciary Committee is going to have a markup. And in that markup, we're going to take that base bill and we're going to put in additional some amendments on there that will protect our constitutional rights more. So things that need to go in there is to have a warrant before the intelligence community or the police apparatus of the federal government can actually query. Now, another word for query is search. But before they can query a U.S. person from a database that they legally obtain by going there, let's just look at it this way. They are looking at people that they're supposed to be looking at, foreign persons or foreign entities who are not in the United States. And when they have that database, and if a U.S. person is encountered in that database, they want to just be able to go in and look at that U.S. person. And we're saying, no, we want a warrant before you can go in there. We want an independent arbiter to adjudicate whether there's reason, which we would call probable cause, to actually even look into that U.S. person.
The Constitution, the Fourth Amendment, protects all persons. It doesn't limit that protection to just Americans. It doesn't limit that protection to just good persons. It doesn't limit that protection to persons that the government likes. It protects everyone. How does the Congress think that by ordinary legislation, not by a constitutional amendment, but by ordinary legislation, it can defy the Fourth Amendment by exempting its protections from a class of people on the basis of where they were born?
There is no even serious argument made right now, Judge, about that. And I'll just tell you why. Is because we're having trouble paring down this law. We're having trouble actually reinventing it and changing the scopes of the parameters so that just U.S. persons, people in the U.S. are protected. And so to move beyond that and say everyone is entitled to Fourth Amendment rights that'd be like a bridge too far. We're having trouble. I guess what I'm saying, we're having trouble moving incrementally where we need to be moving toward, much less going for a home run or a grand slam here.
I want you to tell me and tell us about the phenomenon of the federal government doing indirectly what it absolutely is prohibited from doing directly by purchasing private communications from custodians of them.
Yeah, that is exactly what's happening. So they will buy from, and it isn't just like companies you've ever even heard of. I mean, like Google's got a massive database, obviously, and others do as well. But there are private vendors that will go in and accumulate data. So let's say that you go to a grocery store, Judge, and you sign up to get their little deal so you can get set specials and sales. Well, now all your information is in there. That information is floating around and gets sold elsewhere. And the federal government and its police alphabet soup of police agencies buy this data, and then they can mine it. As you say, I'll give you an example of one called the Hemisphere program. So it's not just in FISA. I mean, people need to understand this. This isn't just in FISA and NSA and FBI. You had a group buying in the Hemisphere program. They were buying data, and then after January 6th, they were using that to try to put people on the Quiet Skies program, which means you're a domestic terrorist, and they're going to take away your right to travel in the U.S., all without any kind of due process, right? So that's called the Hemisphere program. A report has just come out recently on that, exposing that. So we have to clean that up as well. But this is the weaponization of the government, And then what they're doing is what you're talking about is they're essentially making these data brokers as their middlemen, as their agents, and they're claiming that they have the ability then because they're not directly engaged. That's not true, though. The law is very clear on this. You cannot employ someone else to do what the federal government has no right to do, and the case law I think is pretty clear on that over time. So that's what they're doing, and we're trying to fight back with this 702 reauthorizations, because the entire FISA thing is not up for reauthorization. It's just 702.
Right.
We're trying to get reforms and attack the entire FISA program as well.
You run your mouth and I run my business, brother. You tell everybody I'm busted. You talk so much you got me disgusted. But you run your mouth and I run my business, brother.
Might not have an answer for this, but also if I was surely convinced that we need to engage in bioweapons research, why aren't you doing this on the North Pole, the South Pole, like as far from people as possibly imaginable? Like I understand, like all those movies of just, people in a remote area cooking up chemicals that might wipe out the human race. And then you end up with a spill, and then the other scientists got to go down there. And then that's when it leaks. And I can write the science fiction movie for you. But why are they doing this near wet markets, near populations? Like, it just seems really dumb.
Yeah. So there's actually a particular reason for that, for militaristic biological application.
Okay.
So in order to create, have you heard about genome-specific biological weapons?
Oh, dude, I'm dumb. I don't know anything about this.
So RFK Jr. has brought it up, and
if I wanted to just wipe out Asian people, or just wipe out Jews, or just wipe out,
you can essentially find like a DNA sequence that is only specific to certain nationalities, and you can I guess make it bigger to make it more fine to specifically target people based on region and ethnicity or race, nationality. So in order to do that, you have to study the blood, the DNA of the individuals of that region. So the reason why that the United States has labs in Ukraine as well as Taiwan, they have over 1,600 there are 1,600 labs in Taiwan, and majority of them are funded by the United States, is because they're studying the DNA of the local inhabitants who are
Isn't it easy enough to ship some blood? You tell the people that, I don't know, you partner with some pharmacy every time, or some doctor's office every time they're running a lab test, and you just ship a little bit of blood. Like, I would think there's an easier way to get your hands on blood than actually having a lab, in the area.
Yeah, it's not just about volume of blood. It would have to be blood from different individuals. So I guess I'm not a medical guy, so I don't know what it would take in order to get, repeated access to different people's blood from different regions. But
you created the main reason, 123andMe, and learn about your ancestors. Yeah, that's what you do. Yeah, or you tell people, hey, you want to start eating a healthier diet? I can tell you the foods that you're allergic to based off your DNA, and people just send it in to you.
Yeah, so actually, Democrat Congressman Jason Crow actually brought up your exact point that 23andMe is actually a nefarious entity that is studying your DNA to develop this information to hand it off to other entities who are looking to. They claim it's for defensive research, but it's really for able to create biological weapons that can delete people based on nationality or ethnicity.
Which makes sense because, like if we went to war with China, you wouldn't want to have to nuke China, because if you really got to nuke China, you're going to be, you're going to create so much massive amounts of pollution on Earth. We're going to have a problem. But I guess if you could, target them with something that only kills people of a certain and no one's comfortable, I guess, even with this concept, because then you're identifying that, I guess, races do have different characteristics. But I can understand, at least if you want to say we're all incredibly different looking but equal in all ways and capacities, you could at least acknowledge that there is I guess slight changes to or enough of a similarity to certain structures of DNA that I mean, it's interesting conceptually, and I understand from a weapon standpoint why, if you could kill off a group of people, like it might be advantageous.
Yeah, from a militaristic standpoint, it's genius. It's probably the greatest weapon anyone's ever created. Say I want to take over a nation, like you said, I can keep all the infrastructure intact and just all the people just die. It's brilliant from, but evil in every single possible way you can imagine.
Right.
But when you're thinking from a militaristic standpoint, say for Russia or China wanted to go to full out all world war, we can remedy the situation rather easily. But as you said, in order to get there, it's dangerous and nefarious and evil in every way.
All right. So what's your prediction for the end of this war? Do you think we're going to continue fighting over there? Do you think we're unwinding? Do you think they work out a peace deal of Putin taking the current territories? Do you think Putin makes more of a push on trying to expose the biolabs? Like, just give us your wild ass prediction of what you're expecting for the next year.
Yeah. So essentially, right now, Ukraine's a war of attrition, and Russia are winning handily. The narrative out there is that it's a stalemate. Russia have established their defensive and fortified positions in eastern Ukraine and cut off Ukraine from getting back into the Donbass and Crimea. So Ukraine are constantly attacking, and they're just losing all their men and losing funding and support worldwide at a rapid pace. So eventually, Russia are completely content sitting where they're at and letting Ukraine continue to just deplete themselves of resources, equipment, weapons, men. So eventually, this is going to come to an end in some sort. The only way that this ends well is if NATO and the West decide not to get into a direct conflict as a result, which it doesn't look like that's going to be the case. It looks like eventually this is going to end. As for how it ends, I couldn't tell you, or when. Russia are totally fine sitting where they're at and letting Ukraine slowly milk themselves to death. And then they're going to take over eastern and southern Ukraine, pretty much the territories they have, and moving. They don't want Western Ukraine. The narrative that Putin's this mass maniac who wants to take over all of Europe, it just, at least from my perspective, doesn't seem to be true.
And
He
so
just wants to.
is he even, I guess, is he even pushing forward anymore? Or it's literally they're holding the line and Ukraine keeps charging at them and just dying. And so they're happy to just, I guess,
they're
deplete
taking
Ukraine.
They're taking small areas around like Advika. Sorry, I can't pronounce it properly. And they're essentially just fighting off advances from Ukraine right now, who are just running headfirst into odds they can't beat.
Right.
I'm sure you have read this, but there was a private cable that Julian Assange dumped from Burns, the current CIA director, who was at the time the ambassador to Russia. This was in 2008. And he sent a private cable to Condoleezza Rice, who was at the time the Secretary of State. And it's titled Niet means Niet.
Exactly.
And the whole thing is about how Ukrainian entry to NATO is the brightest of red lines for everybody in Russia. And they simply will not stand for this. And look, again, it's not reasonable that Vladimir Putin invaded and killed all of these people, but it is totally reasonable to say you cannot expand your military alliance to our biggest next door neighbor. We would never accept that. And we would totally invade. I mean, you think like if the Soviet Union was still around and they said Mexico's a part of the Warsaw Pact, that the Washington, D.C. would just go, well, they made their decision. We're just going to.
We almost went to war over missiles in Cuba.
Yeah, right, exactly.
No, you're totally right. And by the way, that Burns memo, which I've read, he doesn't just in my read of it, doesn't just report that this is the Russian position. He validates it. He's like, yeah, you get it. Like that's that's not a crazy position to have. And I just was with Assange in prison, in Belmarsh prison in London, like last week or 2 weeks ago. And they're torturing him to death, obviously. And I'm thinking to myself, like, why would they? It's what they're doing to him is so cruel. Why would they do that? And it's stuff like that. It's the Burns memo. Because it really laid, if you knew what was really going on, these people would be on their way to prison. And so you can't have Julian Assange's. You can't have anyone who tells the truth because it's big a threat.
Anyway, so let me ask you just a little bit about this kind of latest conflict. It seems like in the right, and when I say the right, I just mean broadly, like say the right half of America. It seems like there's been this kind of split where 50% of the right stepped into a time machine and is now in 2002. And then there seems to be the other half that I think you are kind of in, where you're still like, hey, but I thought we kind of learned some lessons over the last 20 years. And I thought the whole America First movement was kind of about like, shouldn't our government be primarily concerned with what's best for our country? Can we at least have a conversation maybe before we just give a blank check to level Gaza? And what's this kind of been like for you? We responded on the show to Ben Shapiro kind of really emotionally attacking you over saying, like, hey, we have a lot of very serious problems here that don't seem to generate nearly as much concern amongst the political class. Like, what have you thought about this dynamic and this kind of shift in the right in America?
Well, I mean, honestly, there are days when I've tried not to think about it because it's just too revealing. I mean, it's really like walking in on your parents having sex. You want to unsee it. Like you shouldn't. There's some things you don't ever want to see. And one of them is people revealing themselves to be totally false, just like deeply dishonest frauds. And there's been a lot of that. Look, so most of my opinions on most things are not very interesting. And I have a million opinions on a million different countries because I've traveled so much over my life. But one thing I've learned is like the closer you get to something, the less you realize you understand it, And so I really am trying to discipline myself to focus on the country that I live in and that my children are living in, which is the US. And so I just from day one, I'm like, I've got all kinds of opinions about a whole suite of different issues and countries, but I want to, for the purposes of my job, like focus on this country. Number one, we have freedom of speech. It's guaranteed in our Constitution. It's the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights. And anything that abridges that is not only unconstitutional, it's immoral. And so we just have to stick to that no matter what. I don't care if there's a war, a financial meltdown, or riots in the streets. I get to say what I think because I'm a free man, not a slave. Okay. So anyone who is against that is transactionally my enemy. Okay.
Right.
Number one. Number two, I don't want to get into a war that doesn't benefit us. We've done that a lot over the past 20 years. I've covered all of those wars. I think I can say with certainty we didn't benefit. And by the way, those countries didn't benefit either, for what it's worth. And so I don't want to do it again. Number three, we're not capable of winning a war in a meaningful sense with Iran. If they closed the Straits of Hormuz, we would have a full financial meltdown. Like we'd be poor, like in a day. So the stakes are incredibly high, leaving aside the potential for nuclear conflict. I don't want that. And the fourth thing I want is the ability to like have a conversation about it. For example, on the question of refugees, there are 2.5 million people living in Gaza. Obviously, a lot of people of Israel want them to leave. I get it, whatever, that's their country. But their argument is these people are too dangerous to live next to us. Okay, That's their view. But then for people to argue that they should come here, wait, I thought you just told us they're too dangerous to live in the place they were born, so they have to come to the United States. What does that say about how you feel about the United States? It tells me that you consider this country, my children's country, a trash bin into which to throw your shit when you're done with it. And I'm so offended by that attitude. I can't even process. Like, it actually makes me red in the face mad. It's so disrespectful to my country that I can barely deal with it. And I have a lot of trouble speaking to, like, people can have their views about, is it justified to kill thousands of civilians? Okay, I'm trying to stay out of it. But nobody can justify that argument, that these people are too disgusting and immoral and dangerous to live next to Israel, but they should live in the United States. Fuck you if you're making that argument. And
yeah,
I mean,
100%. One of the things that was really amazing to me was to see when Donald...
Sorry, I lost control. It makes me so mad.
You're absolutely right.
My wife or something. It's so... You don't even like America if you're making that argument.
Well, no, and like you said... Like you said, I mean, I have the same attitude. Like, my kids are growing up in this country, so I don't care about the future of this country. I care about it more than I've ever cared about anything else in the world. That's the most important thing, is where my kids are growing up. Like, what life are they going to have? And it's not like there's one or two people making this argument. This is like the establishment of the Republican Party's position.
Some people over the years have taken the position when we put out a message like this that, whoa, dude, that's going too far. You got to show these people some at least respect of the office. That's out of line. But in response to the largest government in history, the entity that claims power over virtually every aspect of our lives, when it's not supposed to be doing that, I mean, they claim the power over what kind of light bulbs we can have, how much water we're going to have in our toilets, what kind of plants we can grow in our own backyard and consume in our home, and what kind of tools we can use for our natural right of self-defense. These people don't deserve respect, in my opinion. But here's James Otis Jr., who put it this way: when our rights are invaded, it is high time to throw aside prudence. And when I think of most of their so-called acts, laws, rules, regulations, and orders that have been on the books, whether it's today or for decades and decades, most of them shouldn't exist. And it reminds me of Thomas Jefferson's great quote: "Law is often but the tyrant's will, and always so when it violates the rights of the individual." Man, that is absolutely timeless stuff. So how do you deal with that? And surprisingly, I want to cite Alexander Hamilton from Federalist number 33. Of course, he said whatever he needed to say for the audience in front of him to get what he wanted. So he probably wasn't even on board with this. But maybe he certainly was a flip-flopper. But the message is what's important here. He's talking about the Supremacy Clause and points out that acts of the large society which are not pursuant to its constitutional powers will be merely acts of usurpation and will deserve to be treated as such. The word usurpation is important. This is how the founding generation, the old revolutionaries, described acts that are not authorized or delegated to the government. Arbitrary power, for example. If we think of the grievances, listed grievances in the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson in the text actually called them injuries and usurpation. So when they go beyond their limits, we're supposed to treat them as a usurpation of power. Either that means it needs to be resisted or completely disregarded. And when it comes to principles of the American Revolution, there were not too many people who were more influential on the old revolutionaries than a guy named Algernon Sidney. And here's how he put it: "That which is not just is not law, and that which is not law ought not to be obeyed." Not only do they deserve to not be obeyed when they go beyond the limits of their delegated powers, they ought not to be obeyed as well. And this mentality was certainly carried forward in the ratification debates over the Constitution in 1787, 1788. James Madison, I think I most prominently highlight from Federalist number 46. He said, how do you deal with a federal government that does unwarrantable stuff, unconstitutional? Or for Madison, even if it does warrantable but unpopular stuff, he recommended a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union for states and individuals. And he said if a bunch of states did the same thing, and again, states doesn't just mean state governments, it's the people comprising those political bodies, those societies. If a bunch of them do this same thing, this refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union would present obstructions which the federal government would hardly be willing to encounter. In other words, the government, without support of the people in the states, is not going to be able to implement its stuff. Or even more aggressive, here's Archibald MacLean in the, I believe, Virginia Ratifying Convention. Do I have that right? Archibald MacLean. I'm just having a little brain fart here. He said, how should we respond to government? I got to look this up. Where did Archibald MacLean come from? Archibald MacLean. Where was he? Archibald MacLean. North Carolina Ratifying Convention. Wow, I should have this down by now, but every now and then I'll screw it up. But here's Archibald MacLean. He's saying, hey, what do we do when they go beyond their limits? How should we respond? And he said, this is what we should do. We should respond to them by saying, you cannot exceed the power prescribed by the Constitution. We will disregard it and punish you for the attempt. So again, when they go beyond their limits, it has to be treated as a usurpation. And like Hamilton was saying in Federalist 33, but also what Sidney was saying. And here's McLean saying, we're going to disregard it and then go further, punish you for the attempt. St. George Tucker had a similar take in his view of the Constitution of the United States, published in 1803. He said, acts of Congress to be binding must be made pursuant to the Constitution. Otherwise, they are not laws, but a mere nullity, or what is worse, acts of usurpation. So again, usurpation, they are not laws, they're just stuff that they put on paper. But how do you deal with it? He said the people are not only not bound by them, but the several departments and officers of the governments, both federal and state, are bound by oath to oppose them. For being bound by oath to support the Constitution, they must violate that oath whenever they give their sanction by obedience or otherwise to any unconstitutional act of any department of the government. And I can't have a conversation like this without citing Lysander Spooner's great defense, A Defense for Fugitive Slaves in 1850. And here's one part of it. If you haven't read this one yet, you really got to do it. It'll be linked to in the show notes. It's free over at Liberty Fund, and it's got a ton of great strategic advice and insight. But Spooner put it this way: to say that an unconstitutional law must be obeyed until it is repealed is saying that an unconstitutional law is just as obligatory as a constitutional one, for the latter is binding only until it is repealed. He said there would therefore be no difference at all between a constitutional and an unconstitutional law in respect to their binding force, and that would be equivalent to abolishing the Constitution and giving to the government unlimited power. Ultimately, if you continue to comply with stuff that's unconstitutional, and you're waiting for the government to determine if the government violated the rules given to the government by the people of the several states, then government does, as Jefferson put it as well in 1798 in his Kentucky resolutions, that is giving them unlimited power. Benjamin Franklin sums it up best: make yourselves sheep, and the wolves will eat you.
And when you think about it, well, would the government ever come along and steal your gold if you were staving gold? Well, they did it already, and a long time ago. The people didn't fuss with it. 1933. Roosevelt, as soon as he gets in office, he confiscates the gold at $20 an ounce, and then he revalues at $35 an ounce. And guess who benefited from that markup? The government, so that they could, inflate at will for all the nonsense that they want to get involved with. So it's been going on a long time, and that's why you can't know exactly what will happen. But the governments will not ignore what is happening today, because if people are protecting and actually an answer to the fiat money, the government is not going to like that. So that's a big burden, but it's also part of the system, and it's also part of human nature and how it's been going on for thousands of years, how there are some people who are evil and mischievous, and they'll steal and rob, and the destruction and the manipulation of monetary policy has been known for a long, long time. And so they're going to continue to do that. So, of course, I fight for sound money and getting the government out of the way and make them quit doing the things they are doing. But still, we all should participate in working for a free society with that sound money. The founders gave us sound money. Then in the Federal Reserve got to the point where they finally destroyed any semblance of trying to keep our dollar related to gold.
So I personally don't think that America is the same as 1933. There was a lot more trust in government in 1933. Unfortunately, the trust led to a lot of bad things than today. And so they're already taking your dollars. And you think, no, I go to my bank account and it's the same. I don't see any dollars missing. No, they don't take the amount. But what those dollars buy, now you're buying a lot less, even though you have the same amount. And that's because they're destroying the value of the dollar. So they're already stealing from you right now. So if you're worried about them stealing gold, they can't counterfeit gold. Okay. So there's that. And I also wanted to bring up President Biden, one of his tweets. Of course, politicians never blame themselves. So they have to blame someone else for the inflation. And his tweet was funny. He says, "Let me be clear." And, whenever they start with "let me be clear," get ready, because they're about to snow you. So he says, "Let me be clear to any corporation that hasn't brought prices back down, even as inflation has come down. It's time to stop the price gouging. Give Americans consumers a break." Now, this is such deception. Inflation is not down. Inflation is still up. It's just less than several months ago, but it's still rising. Prices are still rising. It's the same as when government spends more one year over the previous year, but if it's a less percentage, they call it a cut. They're cutting and everything is going to fall apart, but they're still spending more. So it's the same thing with inflation. That's how they deceive you. And I feel bad, even though they are on the rotten end of the stick, for the businesses that create products, because they have to adapt.
their prices are also rising, and their consumers expect to pay relatively the same thing. So what are they supposed to do? And that's why we see shrinkflation. You see the package gets a little bit smaller, but the price when you go to the store is still the same. So you feel like and they really that's their option, because they can't go to everybody and teach everybody economics and say, this is why we're doing this. We're getting squeezed. We have to stay in business. We have to stay profitable to stay in business. They can't go and explain to everybody, but consumers are still upset, and because you could see it. I see it when I go to the store. You're getting less, but paying the same amount that you did before. But you're getting less. And it's easy to just blame, it's the company. It's the company. And that's what Biden is doing here. He's trying to blame them. But it's the Bidens, it's the Trumps, it's the Obamas, it's all of them that spend trillions and trillions of dollars that they do not have, that the Federal Reserve prints, and that's why the dollar loses its value continually. But they will never point the fingers at themselves, which is where it belongs.
It'll be a hard time to find out what the next unit of account will be, but I'll tell you one thing, history will always defend a unit of account as being gold. They've done it for 5,000 years, and that's what they have to go back to, but it's going to be a rocky road to get back to that. So anyway, I think the monetary system gives you a lot of information. It's fascinating. It tells you a lot about human nature. It also tells you about the very evilness in people that want to have a free ride at the expense of the middle class and the poor, because when you inflate, you're taxing the poor, and the rich are getting richer, and that's why we end up with political chaos, and this bankruptcy has a long way to do before it's over. We're going to do our very best to expose the culprits that have run this and get people to try to get protected the best they can, and in the meantime, it doesn't mean that it's inevitable that we have to live like this forever. If we do the right thing, really, if we did the right thing, there would be some pain with it. And if you just took your hands on and let people take care of things, it would last about a year. What if you could work and you didn't have any forms to fill out, you didn't have any regulations, you didn't have any taxes to pay? People would go back to work. No welfare, though. People would go back to work. You mean I can go out and work and I don't have to do all this thing? Yeah, it would be pretty nice. So the solution is not difficult, it's not complicated, but it's politically resisted by the powerful elite, and that's where our problem is. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.
Most of us must have noticed the automatic governor on a steam engine. It usually consists of two balls or weights, which work by centrifugal force. As the speed of the engine increases, these balls fly away from the rod to which they are attached, and so automatically narrow or close off a throttle valve, which regulates the intake of steam and thus slows down the engine. If the engine goes too slowly, on the other hand, the balls drop, widen the throttle valve, and increase the engine's speed. Thus, every departure from the desired speed itself sets in motion the forces that tend to correct that departure. It is precisely in this way that the relative supply of thousands of different commodities is regulated under the system of competitive private enterprise. When people want more of a commodity, their competitive bidding raises its price. This increases the profits of the producers who make that product. This stimulates them to increase their production. It leads others to stop making some of the products they previously made and turn to making the product that offers them the better return. But this increases the supply of that commodity at the same time that it reduces the supply of some other commodities. The price of that product, therefore, falls in relation to the price of other products, and the stimulus to the relative increase in its production disappears. In the same way, if the demand falls off for some product, its price and the profit in making it go lower, and its production declines. It is this last development that scandalizes those who do not understand the price system they denounce. They accuse it of creating scarcity. Why, they ask indignantly, should manufacturers cut off the production of shoes at the point where it becomes unprofitable to produce anymore? Why should they be guided merely by their own profits? Why should they be guided by the market? Why do they not produce shoes to the full capacity of modern technical processes? The price system and private enterprise conclude the production for use philosophers are merely a form of scarcity economics. These questions and conclusions stem from the fallacy of looking at one industry in isolation, of looking at the trees and ignoring the forest. Up to a certain point, it is necessary to produce shoes, but it is also necessary to produce coats, shirts, trousers, homes, plows, shovels, factories, bridges, milk, bread. It would be idiotic to go on piling up mountains of surplus shoes simply because we could do it, while hundreds of more urgent needs went unfilled. Now, in an economy in equilibrium, a given industry can expand only at the expense of other industries. For at any moment, the factors of production are limited. One industry can be expanded only by diverting to it land, labor, and capital that would otherwise be employed in other industries. And when a given industry shrinks or stops expanding its output, it does not necessarily mean that there has been any net decline in aggregate production. The shrinkage at that point may have merely released capital and labor to permit the expansion of other industries. It is erroneous to conclude, therefore, that a shrinkage of production in one line necessarily means a shrinkage in total production. Everything, in short, is produced at the expense of foregoing something else. Costs of production themselves, in fact, might be defined as the things that are given up, the leisure and pleasures, the raw materials with alternative potential uses, in order to create the thing that is made. It follows that it is just as essential for the health of a dynamic economy that dying industries should be allowed to die as that growing industries should be allowed to grow. For the dying industries absorb labor and capital that should be released for the growing industries. It is only that much vilified price system that solves the enormously complicated problem of deciding precisely how much of tens of thousands of different commodities and services should be produced in relation to each other. These otherwise bewildering equations are solved quasi-automatically by the system of prices, profits, and costs. They are solved by this system incomparably better than any group of bureaucrats could solve them. For they are solved by a system under which each consumer makes his own demand and casts a fresh vote or a dozen fresh votes every day, whereas bureaucrats would try to solve it by having made for consumers not what the consumers themselves wanted, but what the bureaucrats decided was good for them.